Somewhere off the coast of a continent that may or may not exist, there's a city with walls of bronze, tin, and shining orichalc, canals wider than modern highways, a palace at the centre ringed by concentric moats, elephants roaming green hills, a civilization so advanced, so wealthy, so seemingly perfect that it eventually angers the gods themselves. And then, in a single day and a single night, it sinks beneath the waves and disappears forever. You've probably heard some version of this story. Atlantis, the lost island, the sunken empire. For over 2,000 years, people have searched for it in the Atlantic, in the Mediterranean, in the Caribbean, even in Antarctica. Explorers have spent fortunes. Documentaries have promised proof. And yet, here's the strange part. Almost none of that searching starts where the story actually starts. Because Atlantis isn't some ancient legend passed down through countless cultures, like the flood myths you find almost everywhere on Earth. It has a birth certificate, a single point of origin. One writer writing at one specific moment in history, who put these words on a page for what appears to be the very first time. Everything else, every map, every theory, every documentary, with dramatic music and grainy sonar footage, all of it traces back to just two texts written by one Greek philosopher, about 2,400 years ago. That's what makes this story different from most legends we tell around here. We're not chasing whispers passed down by firelight for 10,000 years. We're chasing a paper trail, an actual traceable historical source. And when you follow that trail carefully, patiently, the way a historian would rather than the way a treasure hunter would, you find something far more interesting than a sunken city. You find out why we tell this story in the first place, and what it might have been trying to say long before anyone started drawing it on maps. Tonight we're going back to the beginning. Not to the ocean floor, not to some crystal-powered fantasy civilization, but to Athens, to a philosopher named Plato, and to the two dialogues where this whole idea was born. We'll look at what he actually wrote, word for word, as best it survives. We'll separate what's clearly stated from what's been added later, layer by layer, over centuries of retelling. And we'll be honest about the difference between evidence, the things we can actually verify, and interpretation, the theories, however tempting, that fill in the gaps. This isn't going to be a story that tells you Atlantis was definitely real, hidden under some specific patch of seafloor waiting to be found. It's also not going to tell you it was nothing but pure fiction, with zero connection to the real world. The truth, as usual, lives somewhere quieter, somewhere more interesting than either extreme. So get comfortable. Let your mind settle. This one moves slow, the way these stories always do, built for drifting rather than staying sharp. If you're listening in bed right now, half awake already, go ahead and drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. I read them in the mornings, and there's something comforting about picturing all of you scattered across time zones, half the world falling asleep while I'm just waking up. Now, let's go back. Back before the searches, before the theories, before the maps. Back to where this story actually begins. Before we get to Plato, before we get to bronze walls and sinking islands, we need to slow down even further and ask a different question. Why would anyone in ancient Greece even find a story like Atlantis believable in the first place? Why would a tale about a whole civilization getting wiped out in a single catastrophic event feel familiar rather than absurd? The answer is that Plato wasn't inventing the idea of a world-ending flood out of nowhere. He was drawing on something his audience already knew in their bones, stories that had been circulating for generations, stories about drowned worlds and vanished golden ages that came long before anyone had ever heard the word Atlantis. Greek mythology is soaked in water, quite literally. Floods show up again and again as a kind of narrative reset button, a way of explaining why the world looks the way it does now instead of the way it apparently used to. And the most important of these flood stories, the one every educated Greek would have known, centres on two names: Deucalion and Pyrrha. Here's the shape of it. Zeus, ruler of the gods, becomes disgusted with humanity. Not angry in a petty way, but genuinely fed up with human wickedness, violence, disrespect for the gods, that sort of cosmic bad behaviour that keeps showing up across mythologies everywhere. So he decides to wipe the slate clean. He sends a flood, a real civilization-ending deluge that covers the earth and drowns nearly everyone. Nearly everyone, because there's always someone who survives in these stories, isn't there? In this case, it's Deucalion, a righteous man, sometimes described as the son of Prometheus, and his wife Pyrrha. Warned in advance, they build a chest. Some versions call it an ark, though that word comes with a lot of baggage from other traditions, and they float through the flood while the rest of humanity disappears beneath the waves. When the waters finally recede, Deucalion and Pyrrha step out into an empty, mud-covered world and are basically tasked with repopulating it. In the most famous version of the myth, they're instructed to throw stones over their shoulders, and the stones transform into new human beings. It's strange and a little surreal, but that's mythology for you. The important part isn't the mechanics, it's the pattern. Humanity messes up. The gods respond with catastrophe. Almost everyone dies. A tiny remnant survives and starts over. Civilization gets a hard reboot. If that structure sounds familiar, it should. You can find versions of it practically everywhere. The Mesopotamian flood story of Utnapishtim, the biblical story of Noah, flood traditions among indigenous peoples across multiple continents. Whether these stories share some deep common origin or simply emerged independently because floods are, historically speaking, one of the most common disasters humans actually experience, is still debated by scholars. But either way, the point stands. A Greek audience hearing about a civilization destroyed by flood wasn't hearing something exotic. They were hearing something that echoed a story pattern baked into their culture from childhood. But floods weren't the only mechanism the Greeks used to explain why the world used to be different. There's another idea running through Greek thought, maybe even more relevant to Atlantis than the flood myths themselves, and that's the concept of declining ages. The poet Hesiod, writing centuries before Plato, laid out a framework that basically every educated Greek would have absorbed. According to Hesiod, human history unfolds across a series of ages, each one worse than the last. First comes the Golden Age, a time when humans lived like gods, without toil, without suffering, without even really aging. Then comes the Silver Age, still good, but noticeably diminished. Then the Bronze Age, marked by violence and warfare. And eventually the current age, the Iron Age, which Hesiod describes with a kind of exhausted bitterness, full of hardship, moral decay, and constant struggle. Notice what's happening here. This isn't a story about steady progress. It's the opposite. It's a story about decline, about a golden past that's been lost and can never quite be recovered. And within that structure is a really important idea for understanding Atlantis. The idea that somewhere in the deep past there existed a civilization, or a way of life, that was more perfect, more advanced, more harmonious than anything existing now. A lost golden age. Sound familiar? It should, because that's essentially the emotional core of the Atlantis story too. A once great civilization, wealthy beyond imagination, advanced beyond its neighbours, that ultimately falls whether through moral corruption or divine punishment, or some combination of both. Plato didn't need to invent the concept of a lost golden civilization. He inherited it. It was already sitting there in Greek cultural memory, ready to be picked up and reshaped. Now, here's where we need to be careful, because this is exactly the kind of place where people get tempted to draw straight lines that don't actually exist. It would be easy to say, well, obviously Deucalion's flood and the ages of man and Atlantis are all describing the same real historical event, just remembered differently by different storytellers. But that's not really how myth works, and it's not how memory works either. What myths preserve, generally speaking, isn't precise geography or exact dates or specific casualty counts. What they preserve are themes, emotional truths, if you want to call them that. The fear of losing everything in an instant, the suspicion that things used to be better, the moral logic that says catastrophe follows corruption, that pride and excess eventually get punished. These are the load-bearing beams of the stories, not the coordinates. So when scholars look at the relationship between older Greek myths and Plato's Atlantis, they're not usually arguing that Atlantis is secretly Deucalion's flood in disguise, or that there's a literal historical thread connecting them. What they're arguing is something subtler, and honestly, more interesting. That Plato was writing into a cultural context already primed to expect stories like this. An audience raised on tales of divine punishment, lost golden ages, and civilization-ending floods wasn't going to blink twice at hearing about a wealthy island empire that grew arrogant and sank beneath the sea in a single day and night. That structure wasn't strange to them. It was, in a sense, exactly what they expected a story about the deep past to sound like. This matters enormously for how we should approach Atlantis going forward, because it means the story didn't need to be historically true to feel true. It only needed to fit the shape of stories his audience already trusted. Plato was, in many ways, working with familiar clay. What he built out of it, though, and why he built it the way he did, that's a very different question. And to answer it, we need to actually meet the man himself. So, Plato, the name everybody knows, the man everybody quotes, the person almost nobody actually reads for fun. To understand what he's doing with Atlantis, we have to place him back in the world he was actually living in, because his story about a drowned island isn't floating in some abstract, timeless space. It's anchored in a very specific city, at a very specific moment, with very specific wounds. Plato was an Athenian. He grew up in a city that had just ridden the roller coaster of history. Within living memory, Athens had gone from rising democratic experiment to superpower of the Aegean, to cultural showpiece of the Greek world, and then crashed through war, plague, and political chaos. The Peloponnesian War against Sparta dragged on for decades. Athens lost. Its walls were torn down. An oligarchic regime backed by Sparta, the so-called 30 tyrants, took power and began executing and exiling citizens. One of the people swept up in all of this was Socrates, Plato's teacher. Plato watched the democracy he grew up in condemn Socrates to death by legal vote. This was not a distant philosophical puzzle for him. It was personal. His city, the proud, clever, self-confident Athens that liked to think of itself as the teacher of Greece, had lost a catastrophic war, humiliated itself politically, and then killed the man Plato believed was the wisest person he had ever met. That's the emotional background hum in Plato's work. When he's talking about ideal states, corrupted cities, and the rise and fall of societies, he isn't playing a purely academic game. He is trying to figure out what went wrong with Athens and whether human beings are even capable of building a just and stable community that doesn't self-destruct the moment it becomes rich and powerful. Now, Plato could have written treatises, dry, straight-line arguments, on the state, on the soul, on why my city is a mess. Some later philosophers did exactly that. But Plato chose something stranger and more flexible. He wrote dialogues. On the surface, these dialogues are conversations. Socrates talking with a young aristocrat, a group of men at a dinner party, an old sophist arguing with a brash newcomer. People interrupt each other, change their minds, get flustered, go off on tangents. It feels casual. Underneath, it's anything but casual. Plato is using conversation as a teaching machine. Dialogues let him do several things at once. He can lay out arguments clearly, but he can also stage them, almost like little plays. He can give different positions to different characters, some sharp, some foolish, some sincere, but confused. You, as the listener, get pulled into the debate. You start silently siding with one person, cringing at another, noticing what goes unanswered. Instead of telling you what to think, Plato is trying to train you how to think. This is where the layering comes in. On one level, you have people arguing about justice, or love, or the origin of the universe. On another level, you have the emotional drama of who these people are, what their social status is, what's left unsaid between them. And beneath that, you often have a hidden structure, echoes from other myths, political allusions, coded references to real events his audience would recognize. The dialogue becomes a kind of puzzle box. There's always another compartment to open if you're patient enough. Now fold in another Greek distinction that Plato is very aware of, mythos and logos. Roughly story and rational explanation, narrative and argument. The world of gods and heroes versus the world of careful reasoning. Plato doesn't simply choose one and reject the other. He plays them against each other. Sometimes Socrates spends an entire dialogue grilling someone with relentless logic. Sometimes, when the argument reaches its limit, Plato suddenly lets a myth walk on stage. A story about the soul choosing its next life. A tale of a traveller who dies in battle, visits the afterlife, and comes back to report what he saw. Or, in our case, a grand story about an ancient city and an island empire that falls beneath the sea. When Plato uses mythos, he usually tells you in one way or another that he's shifting gears. You'll hear phrases like, "We must accept a likely story," or "Let me tell you a tale, not wholly true perhaps, but useful." He signals that we're moving from strict proof into the territory of imaginative exploration. This doesn't mean he expects you to switch your brain off. Quite the opposite. He expects you to ask different questions. Not did this happen on exactly this date, at exactly these coordinates, but what is this story arranged to make me feel? What picture of humans, gods, and cities is it trying to leave in my mind? What parts feel plausible and why? Plato's readers are not meant to swallow his stories whole. They're meant to taste them, turn them over, separate the flavour of what could be literally true from the flavour of what is clearly symbolic or exaggerated. He trusts his audience to notice when the numbers suddenly become impossibly large, or when the moral pattern of a myth lines up a little too neatly with a philosophical point he's been developing elsewhere. And that brings us to a crucial question. Why does the Atlantis story show up where it does in Plato's work, instead of, say, in a random poem or a travelogue? Atlantis appears in two dialogues, Timaeus and Critias. These are not casual pieces. They're part of a late project where Plato is trying to do something very ambitious, sketch a picture of the universe, the soul, and the ideal city all at once. Timaeus dives into cosmology, the structure of the world, how the gods supposedly shape the cosmos into order from chaos. Critias, the unfinished sequel, pivots into history, or what looks like history, an account of ancient Athens and its confrontation with a mighty sea power from beyond the known Greek world. In other words, Plato slots the Atlantis tale right at the junction, where he is blending cosmic order with human political order. He doesn't drop it into a comedy or a love story. He weaves it into a conversation about what a good city is, how it might be tested, and what happens when wealth and power pull a society away from its guiding virtues. For his original audience, this positioning would have been loud. A story introduced in a high philosophical dialogue, told by reputable characters, framed as something passed down from wise lawgivers and foreign priests, is not just entertainment. It's bait. It invites the careful listener to wonder, how much of this is history? How much is crafted example, and does that distinction even matter if the point is to see ourselves in it? When we approach Atlantis, then, we have to come in with Plato's own toolkit. Recognize the dialogue as drama and argument intertwined. Recognize myth and reason as partners, not enemies. And stay alert to the way plausibility, detail, and moral architecture all interact. Because the story he's about to tell isn't just about a vanished island. It's about what a city can become, and how it can fall. And he places that story exactly where it will sting most, in the shadow of real Athens, the city he loved, and the city that had already fallen once in his lifetime. When people talk about Atlantis, they usually talk as if there's a whole lost library behind it. Ancient maps, secret Egyptian scrolls, forgotten temple inscriptions. But if you strip all of that away and just ask, what is the oldest surviving text that actually tells the Atlantis story? You end up with something surprisingly small. Not a bookshelf, a handful of pages. All of Atlantis, as far as Antiquity is concerned, lives in two works by one man. Plato's dialogues called Timaeus and Critias. That's it. No earlier Greek epic about Atlantis. No standalone Atlantis tragedy. No travelogue from some wandering sailor who saw its ruins with his own eyes. There are other flood myths, other sunken lands, other golden ages that ended badly, but the city called Atlantis with its concentric rings and its war with ancient Athens, that's Plato, and only Plato. And even there, the picture is broken. Timaeus is complete. Critias is not. Both dialogues are set on the day after another of Plato's big works, the Republic. Think of it as the morning after conversation. The night before in the Republic, Socrates and his friends have spent hours constructing an ideal city in theory. A perfectly ordered polis, built from the ground up out of arguments about justice, education, and the soul. Now it's the next day. Everyone's had time to sleep on it. They gather again, and Socrates more or less says, "We made a beautiful city in words." But that's all it is so far. Words. It would be even better if we could see this ideal city in action, tested in real events. That's the opening Plato gives himself. He wants to move from pure blueprint to field test. Critias, one of the characters, jumps in with an offer. He says, in effect, "I happen to have just the thing." A very old, very true story about ancient Athens in a time of crisis, when it faced down a powerful empire from across the sea. It will let us watch your ideal city behave, not in imagination, but in a supposedly historical case. The empire in question is Atlantis. But before the story itself unfolds, Plato does something important. Through Critias, he builds a chain of transmission. He doesn't have Socrates say, "I invented this neat tale." He doesn't have an anonymous bard walk in and sing. He has Critias insist that this story has been preserved and handed down. Here's the chain, as Plato gives it. Critias, the speaker, says he heard it as a child from his grandfather, also called Critias. That grandfather heard it from his own ancestor, the famous Athenian lawgiver Solon. And Solon, in turn, got the story when he visited Egypt, 9 generations earlier, and talked with priests in the city of Sais in the Nile Delta. So, Egyptian temple archives, Egyptian priests, Solon, the lawgiver, the elder Critias, the younger Critias, Socrates and friends, Plato's written dialogue. Plato is very explicit about this ladder. He has the Egyptian priests rebuke Solon, saying that the Greeks are like children, always forgetting their past when disasters wipe the slate clean. Egypt, they claim, has older records. In those records, they say, is a tale about a very ancient Athens, 9,000 years before Solon, and an island power called Atlantis that tried to dominate the world and was eventually destroyed by earthquakes and floods. Inside the dialogue, this is presented not as an entertaining fable, but as what the priest calls an alethinos logos, a true story, a true account. Critias repeats that label. He insists he will tell the story not as a fiction but as fact. On the surface, that sounds straightforward. Plato is claiming it's historically true, but the moment you relax into that, everything you know about how Plato uses mythos and logos should start tugging on your sleeve, because this is exactly the kind of situation where he likes to blur the line. He gives you a careful, almost bureaucratic genealogy for the tale. He invokes respectable names: Solon, lawgiver of Athens, Egyptian priests, guardians of ancient wisdom. He anchors the story in recognizable places: the Nile Delta, the city of Sais, the Acropolis. He sprinkles in specific dates and measurements and genealogies. All of that scaffolding says, you're allowed to treat this as sober history. Meanwhile, at the same time, he is using the story to do unmistakably philosophical work, testing the ideal city, contrasting a virtuous, disciplined Athens with a rich, arrogant sea power that has drifted away from its original virtues, showing how luxury corrodes, how empires overreach. So when Critias swears that this is a true story, there are at least two ways to hear that. One is literal. These events really happened, more or less as described, in remote antiquity. The other is more Platonic. This is a story that is true to the moral patterns of the world, true to how cities rise and fall, true in the way a carefully designed parable can be true, even if its names and dates are adjusted for effect. Plato doesn't step out from behind the curtain and settle the question for you. He lets the ambiguity do its work. The story is nailed to a chain of real people and real places, yet it also fits just a little too neatly into the philosophical architecture he's building. And then there's the strangest part of all. We never get to see the whole thing. Timaeus, the first of the two dialogues, spends most of its time on cosmology, the birth of the universe, the nature of the soul, the structure of the physical world. In it, Critias gives a brief summary of the Atlantis tale to set the stage. He promises to come back the next day and tell the full story in detail. Critias, the follow-up dialogue, is supposed to be that full story. It starts to lay out the deep past, how ancient Athens was arranged, how the gods divided the earth, how Poseidon fathered the royal line of Atlantis and built its famous ringed capital, and then, mid-sentence, the text just stops. The last lines we have break off while Critias is still describing the plan of the Atlantean city. No completed war narrative, no detailed account of battles between Athens and Atlantis, no final moral spelled out in Socrates' voice. If Plato ever finished the dialogue, that ending is lost. It might never have been written at all. So the only place in all of ancient literature where Atlantis is described, its geography, its political system, its rise and fall, is this fragmentary patch, a summary in Timaeus and a broken-off speech in Critias. Later ancient authors who mention Atlantis are not drawing on some other secret archive. They are reacting to Plato, they quote him, they allude to him, or they stay silent, which is its own kind of commentary. Every Renaissance utopia that borrows the name, every early modern treatise that speculates about drowned continents, every modern documentary that flashes sonar images of the seafloor and asks, is this Atlantis? All of them are ultimately hanging from the same thin thread. These pages, this interrupted story, this carefully staged true account that comes to us as a half-told tale. To understand Atlantis, then, we have to keep our eyes on that narrow foundation. Before we chase maps or theories or underwater photographs, we have to sit in the quiet of Plato's conversation, listen to what he actually wrote, and notice how he frames it. Because the next piece of the puzzle is not just what the story says, but how it says it came to him in the first place. If you stay with the dialogue, the next thing that happens is almost genealogical. Critias doesn't just say, "I heard this somewhere." He starts building a little family tree. At the top, there's Egypt, specifically the city of Sais in the western Nile Delta. There, in the temple of the goddess Neith, Solon supposedly sat with very old priests who had access to very old records written in very old hieroglyphs. Solon is the next link down, not just any tourist, but one of Athens' 7 sages, the man credited with cancelling debts, reforming laws, and laying the groundwork for Athenian democracy. In Greek cultural memory, Solon is what you might call a serious person. Wise, moderate, not easily fooled. If he hears a tall tale, you expect him to ask questions. If he brings a story home, the implication is that he found it worth trusting. Below Solon comes Dropides, an otherwise obscure relative who, in the story, receives the Egyptian material second-hand. Then the elder Critias, who hears it from Dropides. Then the younger Critias, Plato's character, who claims he got it as a boy at a family festival when his grandfather recited it as part of the evening's entertainment. Priests in Sais, Solon, Dropides, grandfather Critias, grandson Critias, Plato's dialogue. Plato doesn't need to give you this chain. He could just have Critias say, "There was once an island called Atlantis," and move on. Instead, he sinks the story into a lineage of names and generations. He dates things 9,000 years before Solon, 9 generations from Solon to me. He is making you feel the weight of time and the solidity of transmission. That's where Egypt's role becomes important. For Greek audiences in Plato's day, Egypt was not just another foreign country. It was a place with a reputation, immemorially old, deeply religious, rigidly traditional, slightly enigmatic. Herodotus, writing a few decades before Plato, called Egypt the gift of the Nile and filled pages with descriptions of its temples, its priests, its peculiar customs. He also portrays Egyptians as people who keep records going back thousands of years, who can list priest after priest, king after king, far beyond any Greek memory. If you're a Greek trying to tell a story about the very deep past, Egypt is a perfect source. It is ancient but nearby, exotic but reachable, unknown enough that almost anything you attribute to its archives can't easily be checked, but respected enough that your audience will nod along. Of course, the Egyptians would know about a forgotten war 10,000 years ago. Of course they would remember floods. The Greeks had forgotten. So when the priest in Sais tells Solon, "You Greeks are always children. You have no belief handed down by ancient tradition, no knowledge hoary with age," he is playing exactly that role. The stern elder civilization, chiding the upstart for its shallow memory. Solon, for his part, is the ideal Greek to hear this rebuke. Historically, we know he travelled. Ancient sources place him in Lydia and Egypt. Whether every detail is accurate is another question, but by Plato's time, the idea of Solon visiting Egypt and learning things was already in circulation. Plato is plugging into that image, the wise lawgiver humbly sitting at the feet of an older wisdom. All of this gives the Atlantis story a kind of borrowed credibility. It's not just Plato says, it's Solon heard from Egyptians who read it in ancient records, but when you zoom out, you're still dealing with layers of second-hand antiquity. Let's count them. The Egyptian priest says he is reading from records about events that were already thousands of years old when Solon arrived. Solon hears and, we're told, plans to use the story in a poem, but never finishes it. Instead, he passes it on orally to a friend or kinsman. That man passes it to his descendant. That descendant recites it at a family gathering. A child listens, half understanding, and remembers fragments. Decades later, that child, now an old man, retells it to Socrates in a dramatic dialogue. Plato, who is not a character in the dialogue, writes it down, shaping speeches and details to fit his philosophical aims. At every step, the medium shifts, temple inscription to priestly paraphrase, Egyptian to Greek, prose discussion to planned poem, back to prose storytelling, formal recital to childhood memory, memory to literary composition. This is how oral tradition usually works. It doesn't preserve an original word-for-word script. It preserves patterns, big beats, key images, a sense of how the story goes that can be retold, re-emphasized, embellished, or trimmed depending on the occasion. The advantage of this is durability. Stories can survive for centuries without writing, as long as there are people motivated to tell them and communities willing to listen. Flood myths, hero tales, genealogies of kings, they can travel astonishing distances in time and space. The cost is plasticity. Details bend, numbers grow. Names shift to more familiar forms. Foreign landscapes get translated into local terms. A vast empire beyond the Pillars of Heracles might originally have meant far away at the edge of everything, and later listeners might map it onto whatever their current mental map of the world's edge happens to be. Plato seems fully aware of this. In Timaeus, Critias admits he's relying on childhood memory, and that he will try to recall the details as best he can. In Critias, he occasionally pauses to correct himself on numbers or measurements, as if rehearsing something half remembered. Within the fiction, this underscores how fragile the transmission is. Outside the fiction, it also gives Plato wiggle room. He can adjust the story's architecture to suit his purposes, while claiming inside the speech that any oddity is just the haze of age. For historians, this transmission chain creates a very mixed picture. On the one hand, some links are solid. Solon was real. He did travel. Greek contact with Egypt is well attested. Greek admiration for Egyptian antiquity is everywhere in the literature. Plato did write these dialogues. Those are firm points. On the other hand, we have no independent Egyptian text that mentions Atlantis, no inscription from Sais about a war with an island beyond the Western Sea, no Egyptian king lists that clearly match Plato's dates. The specific claim that Egyptian archives contained a detailed account of ancient Athens and Atlantis is something we only know because Plato puts it in the mouth of a character. We also can't audit the family line. Dropides, the supposed middleman, is a thin figure. The elder Critias is historical, but we don't have his version of the story, only Plato's. There is no surviving Solonian poem about Atlantis to compare with Plato's dialogue and say, here is the kernel he actually got. So we're left in a peculiar situation. The Atlantis story comes to us wrapped in the trappings of careful transmission, named authorities, respectable sources, a venerable foreign archive. That framing is part of its persuasive power. It invites you to relax your guard and listen as if to history. But when you ask what can be independently confirmed, the scaffolding thins out quickly. We can verify the taste for Egyptian wisdom, the habit of attaching new stories to old sages, the mechanisms of oral and written retelling. We can't reach past Plato's text to a checkable Egyptian dossier on Atlantis. If such a thing ever existed, it's lost. It may never have existed in the first place. For a legend that feels so concrete, canals and walls measured in stadia, war fleets counted ship by ship, the foundation is oddly ghost-like. A story about records we no longer have, told by people whose voices we only hear through one philosopher's pen. And yet, even with all that uncertainty, the chain does something crucial. It shows you how a myth can be made to feel like memory, how second-hand antiquity can sit in your mind like a half-remembered fact. How the name of a trusted lawgiver and the aura of an ancient temple can turn one man's constructed narrative into a story that generations will swear is too detailed not to be true. From here, we can finally step onto the island itself and see what that constructed narrative actually says about Atlantis, the empire, the capital, and the world. Plato builds on top of this fragile chain. In that constructed world, Atlantis is not just a rumour on the horizon. It's a fully built stage. Critias doesn't start with a vague, faraway kingdom. He gives you an island with measurements, topography, and infrastructure. He tells you there was once a great island, larger than Libya and Asia together, out beyond the Pillars of Heracles. On that island there was a fertile plain, ringed by mountains, open to the sea in one direction and sheltered in the others. In the middle of that plain there was a low hill, and on that hill Poseidon did something very specific. According to the story, Poseidon fell in love with a mortal woman named Plato, who lived on that central hill. To protect her and to mark the place as his own, he reshaped the land. With his divine engineering, he cut the hill into alternating rings of land and water. One ring of sea, one ring of earth, another of sea, another of earth, until there were multiple concentric circles, like ripples frozen in stone. At the centre, on the smallest island, he built a sanctuary for Cleito, enclosed it with a wall of orichalcum, and made it the heart of a new dynasty. Cleito bore him 10 sons in pairs. These became 10 kings, each ruling a portion of the island and its surrounding territories, with the eldest, Atlas, holding the central lot and senior authority. That's where the name comes from. Atlas, son of Poseidon, lord of the central city, giving his name to Atlantis and the surrounding Atlantic Sea. So right away, the city is not growing randomly. It's a divine project laid out from the start around a sacred nucleus. And everything that comes after seems to radiate from that decision. Plato lingers on the layout. The rings are not just picturesque. They're functional. There are bridges thrown over the water belts at carefully chosen points. Canals cut straight through the outer rings so that ships can move from the open sea along a great canal across the plain, through the circular harbours and right up to the innermost basin. There are walls on each ring, each wall sheathed in different metals. The outermost wall is plated in bronze, the next is covered in tin. The innermost gleams with that mysterious orichalcum. Orichalcum, in the text, sits somewhere between myth and metallurgy. Plato treats it as a real substance, only second to gold in value. The Atlanteans, he says, mine it from their own island. They use it to line their temples, to panel their buildings, to inlay the floor of Poseidon's great shrine. By his time, the word already had a long history in Greek literature, sometimes referring to a real copper-based alloy, sometimes to something more legendary. In Atlantis, it becomes the signature material of a super-wealthy empire, the way marble and gold leaf might signal imperial Rome. The wealth scale keeps ratcheting up. The central temple of Poseidon and Cleito is described almost like a tally of luxuries. A roof of ivory ornamented with gold, silver and orichalcum. Walls and pillars panelled and striped with coloured metals. Statues everywhere, the god driving 6 winged horses, 100 Nereids on dolphins, images of the royal family in poses of piety and power. The floor of the temple is paved with orichalcum. The outer enclosure is ringed with golden statues of the 10 kings, standing side by side, facing the shrine. All of this sits inside a wider civic machine. The plain around the city is laid out in a strict grid. A canal runs straight from the city's circular harbour to the sea, cutting across the plain like a spine. Smaller channels branch off, irrigating fields, turning the entire landscape into a kind of engineered garden. Plato gives dimensions in stadia for the length and breadth of the plain, the depth and width of the canal, the distances between the mountain ranges. The impression is not of a mythic wilderness, but of a planned, measured, administrated territory. The political order mirrors the geometry. 10 kings descended from Poseidon's 10 sons rule 10 portions of the realm. They meet periodically in the central temple. They wear special blue robes, sacrifice bulls to their divine ancestor, and swear oaths over a mixing bowl of their blood. They deliberate together on matters of war and law, bound by a set of original statutes supposedly inscribed by Poseidon on a pillar of orichalcum standing in the central shrine. This is where the too detailed not-to-be-true feeling kicks in for a lot of readers. Plato tells you how often the kings meet, what rituals they perform, how they enforce their laws, how they brand offenders. He describes their navy, the number of ships each region must provide, the number of warriors, the arrangement of harbours and shipyards. The capital is not just pretty, it's a command centre for a thalassocracy, a sea empire, sending fleets in all directions. When you step back, though, the pattern starts to look less like an archaeological report and more like a piece of deliberate design. Concentric rings express order radiating from a sacred core. 10 kings neatly bounded echo the Pythagorean love of certain numbers. The metals, stacked from bronze to orichalcum to gold, stage a literal hierarchy of value from outside to inside. The Great Canal across the plain is almost a diagram of centralized control. Water, grain, timber, and ships, all funneled through one axis under one authority. For a philosopher who spends his career asking what an ideal city would look like and what goes wrong when wealth and power corrupt it, this level of urban and political detail is not an accident. The capital of Atlantis reads like a thought experiment you can walk through. If you wanted to dramatize a superpowered state designed for greatness, then watch it slide into arrogance. You would give it exactly this kind of architecture. Impressive, rational, awe-inspiring, but also tightly organized around domination and display. Later seekers of Atlantis pick up on the surface features and run with them. If Plato says there were rings of land and water, people go looking for ring-shaped ruins. A circular bay here, a volcanic caldera there, an eroded plateau with curious ridges. Any natural formation that looks roughly like a bullseye has, at some point, been proposed as the buried capital. If he says there was a great canal crossing a plain, researchers scour satellite images for long straight lines. If he talks about unusual metals, people comb ancient mining districts for traces of something that might be orichalcum. The more specific the description, the easier it is to build checklists. Does this site have 3 rings, a central hill, evidence of huge harbours? Nearby mountains open to the south? In that sense, Plato's rich, engineered city becomes a kind of template, a stencil that enthusiasts lay over real landscapes hoping for a match. Whether that was Plato's intention or not, the effect is the same. His capital of Atlantis is so concrete, so minutely arranged, that it keeps inviting people to confuse literary design with geographic blueprint. The island empire that began as a moral and political model becomes, in later imaginations, a map waiting to be followed, a city that must, somewhere, have left its circles cut into stone. But in Plato's hands, no city exists in a vacuum. A perfectly tuned machine of power needs something to push against. That's where Athens comes in. In Timaeus and Critias, Atlantis is not just a marvel of engineering. It's a rival, a test. The island doesn't sit politely beyond the horizon, minding its own rings and canals. It expands. First it masters its own island, then the surrounding islands. then parts of the opposite continent. Eventually, it stretches its hand toward the Mediterranean, toward this side of the Pillars of Heracles. The way Plato tells it, the Atlanteans don't begin as cartoon villains. In the earliest generations, he says, they still have a share of divine nature. They're moderate, self-controlled, capable of bearing their wealth without going mad. But as time passes and the gods' portion in them thins out, their human half takes over. They start to love wealth for its own sake. They begin to value luxury over virtue, conquest over justice. The same infrastructure that once expressed divine order becomes an engine for imperial appetite. Atlantis, in other words, is what happens when a state with every advantage, resources, technology, divine ancestry, lets its character rot. The rot doesn't show up in the geometry. The walls are still straight, the canals still flow, the ships still launch on schedule. It shows up in motive, expansion for glory, war for spoils, power for its own intoxication. Athens is cast as the opposite pole. Not the noisy, faction-ridden Athens of everyday politics that Plato knew too well, but a purified, earlier version. A city that in the story once occupied a larger, more fertile land, Attica before erosion, with citizens raised in simple habits, devoted to wisdom and virtue. A city that does not build ringed harbours plated in exotic metals, but trains its people in discipline, moderation, and shared responsibility. When the Atlantean Empire finally surges inward and begins to subdue much of the Mediterranean, it is this ancient Athens that stands in the way. According to Critias, all the other Greek states fall or submit. Only Athens resists. Its citizens, poorer in material terms, richer in character, rally themselves, fight back, and push the invaders all the way out of the eastern Mediterranean. Athens becomes the tiny fulcrum against the massive lever of Atlantic power. This is not just a battle scene, it's a parable of political soul types. On one side, a polis that embodies what Plato elsewhere calls the philosopher-guardian ideal. Courageous, orderly, willing to sacrifice wealth and even life for the sake of what is right. On the other, a superstate that embodies the temptations he fears most, luxury, naval empire, and the kind of confidence that comes from never having been truly tested. The clash is almost overdetermined. In the Republic, Plato has Socrates sketch a just city in speech, then let it decline through recognizable political stages, from aristocracy of the wise, to timocracy of honor lovers, to oligarchy of the rich, to democracy of appetite, and finally to tyranny. In the Atlantis story, he does something similar, but dramatized. Athens plays the role of an idealized early-stage city, still governed by reason and virtue. Atlantis stages the later phases, a regime sunk in wealth and prestige, sliding toward tyranny, projecting violence outward as a way to keep its inner decay from turning inward. The outcome fits this moral architecture. The virtuous city survives the test. The decadent empire, having overreached, is struck down, not just in war, but by nature itself. Earthquakes and floods erase Atlantis in a single day and night of misfortune. On one level, that's divine punishment. On another, it's almost an allegory of how unstable such hypertrophied systems really are. When a state builds everything outward on conquest and display, a single shock can bring the whole structure down. Underneath the legend, you can hear very specific anxieties from Plato's own lifetime. He had watched Athens transform from a modest land power into the leader of a naval league, the Delian League, then into an Aegean empire that collected tribute, moved allies' treasuries, and enforced obedience with fleets. He had seen his city intoxicated by power, overconfident enough to launch the disastrous Sicilian expedition, marching thousands of men and hundreds of ships to their destruction far from home. He had seen oligarchic coups, democratic excesses, the execution of generals, the trial and death of Socrates. For someone thinking about how character and constitution interact, the temptation to reframe these experiences into a mythic war between a virtuous Athens and a bloated sea empire would have been strong. Atlantis, in this light, looks less like a lost continent and more like a warning label for imperial projects. It gathers up traits that Greeks associated with powerful sea-states, immense navies, wealth from trade, far-flung possessions, and shows how easily those strengths tip into hubris. Athens, cleansed and idealized, shows what a city might look like if it kept its priorities straight. Simple in lifestyle, rich in virtue, suspicious of luxury, courageous in defense, rather than aggressive in expansion. If you're lying in the dark, half listening, it's easy for the mind to drift back to the map. Where was this island? How big was it? What did its harbours really look like? But from Plato's perspective, the coordinates of Atlantis are almost beside the point. The Atlantean War isn't there to give you directions. It's there to make a contrast visible, to ask which city you recognize in your own world, the shining machine that can't stop expanding, or the smaller, quieter one that holds its ground and then disappears from the stage without fanfare. That's why, for philosophers and classicists, the war narrative often matters more than the island's supposed location. The story is doing political work. It's a mirror held up to power, a thought experiment about what happens when technical brilliance outruns moral restraint. The fact that people keep looking past the mirror, trying to step through it to find a sunken shoreline, tells you something too. We are endlessly drawn to the hardware of the myth, the ships, the metals, the rings, and endlessly tempted to forget that for the person who wrote it down, the real question was never where was Atlantis, but what kind of city are we becoming? Plato doesn't linger over the end of Atlantis. That's part of what makes it so haunting. After a long, almost obsessive description of the island's layout, its canals, its metals, its constitution, after the careful build-up of the war with ancient Athens, the destruction itself happens almost in passing. In Timaeus, it gets just a few lines. In Critias, the narrative breaks off before we even reach it. We're left with a compressed verdict. After its defeat, Atlantis is struck by earthquakes and floods and sinks beneath the sea in one terrible day and night. For Greek ears, that phrasing didn't sound like a random flourish. It drew directly on a vocabulary of disaster that was already familiar. The word Plato uses for the shaking is seismos, a quake. A word that would have conjured up not just gentle tremors, but the kind of ground-ripping events that topple walls and split open roads. Greece is seismically active. Earthquakes weren't abstract. People knew what it felt like for the solid earth to behave like water. And then, inundation. Not a calm rise in sea level over centuries, but sudden overwhelming water. In earlier myths, Zeus wipes out the Bronze Age with a flood. Deucalion survives in a kind of Greek ark. Local traditions told of valleys turned into lakes overnight. Cities swallowed by the sea after the land sank or the water rushed in. Words for catastrophe and punishment ran together. So when Plato strings these terms together, quakes, floods, one day and one night, he's pressing a mythic button his audience already understands. This is the language of cosmic correction, of a world that has watched something go too far and snaps back. The pacing matters. He spends pages letting you walk the rings of Atlantis in your imagination, counting ships, tracing canals, absorbing the scale of its system. He stages the moral decline, the imperial war, the clash with Athens. Then, instead of a long drawn-out fall, he gives you a sudden, clean break. One day, one night. It's like a door that slams shut. Narratively, it does several things at once. It closes the story with a sharp, satisfying finality. The empire that expanded everywhere is now nowhere. The sea that once carried its fleets now covers its foundations. No lingering resistance, no gradual decay, no long chronicle of decline. Just a single stroke. It serves as moral punctuation. In Greek thought, there is a pattern: hubris, overreaching arrogance, followed by nemesis, retribution. The greater the hubris, the more decisive the response. For a city that tried to dominate half the world, only a total erasure feels proportionate within that moral geometry. The speed of the destruction is part of the point. When a society ignores measure, the correction does not have to be slow. It also conveniently explains something very practical inside the fiction: why no one has ever heard of this war or this island. If Atlantis sank, and the Athenians who defeated it were wiped out by earthquakes and floods soon after, there are no monuments to visit, no ships to see, no records to consult. The absence of evidence becomes part of the story's internal logic. From a geological perspective, though, one day and one night is clearly literary compression. Real catastrophic events can be fast on human timescales. A major earthquake can devastate a city in under a minute. A tsunami can strike a coastline with almost no warning after a distant quake. A volcanic island can collapse partially into the sea over hours, triggering waves that sweep harbours and low plains. But an entire island empire, the size Plato describes, with multiple plains, mountains, and a capital city ringed by massive engineering works, disappearing completely under the sea in 24 hours, that stretches beyond what geologists expect outside of extreme scenarios. Submerging coastal zones, harbours, and lowlands, very plausible. Dropping a whole continent-sized block below the waves at once. Not so much. If you tried to imagine a realistic version of the destruction, it might look more like this. A major tectonic event triggers earthquakes and tsunamis. Coastal installations are obliterated. Portions of land subside. Ports become unusable. Saltwater floods far inland. Over years and centuries, erosion, ongoing subsidence, and sea level fluctuations erase the most visible traces. What the survivors remember as the night everything changed becomes, in storytelling, one day and one night when the gods judged a wicked power. In other words, geological realism tends toward messy, multi-stage processes. Plato's version is a clean cut. The difference is the difference between a natural history and a moral exemplum. And yet precisely because the end is framed in what sounds like catastrophic natural language, later readers couldn't resist taking it literally. If he had said, and then, as in a dream, the image of Atlantis faded from the minds of men, few people would go looking for sonar images on the Atlantic floor. But earthquakes, flooding, the island sank, and the repeated formula in a single day and night of misfortune sound like a report, not a parable. They latch onto the part of the brain that says, wait, sudden submergence. That's a physical event. Physical events leave traces. Where's the crater? Where's the caldera? Where's the shelf collapse? Across the centuries, that tiny, dense description of the Cataclysm became the ignition point for all kinds of theories. People asked, which earthquake? Which volcano? Which flood? Was it in the Atlantic? The Mediterranean? Could something like Thera's eruption be the kernel? Could local Greek memories of landslides and coastal subsidence have been bundled into this single emblematic day and night? Once you start down that road, the story stops being just a moral drama and starts looking like a jigsaw puzzle with missing pieces. The fact that Plato never intended to give you seismological data doesn't stop readers from treating his phrasing as if he did. So in that short, brutal ending, you have both sides of the Atlantis tradition in embryo. On the one hand, a crafted piece of philosophical storytelling, hubris, nemesis, and the swift erasure of a corrupt empire, all delivered with the kind of narrative snap that leaves an imprint on the mind. On the other, just enough naturalistic detail, quakes, floods, sinking land, a compressed timescale to tempt later ages into reading a parable as a disaster report. To understand how seriously we should take that report, and what, if anything, in the real world might have echoed into Plato's imagination, we have to step back from the mythic phrasing and look at how he uses history elsewhere. That means asking what kind of truth he thought he was telling. Was Atlantis ever meant to be a chronicle, or was it always a lesson dressed in the clothes of a lost world? When you turn to the text itself, the first odd thing you notice is how hard Plato leans on the phrase true story. Timaeus opens with Socrates wanting a model of a good city in action. Critias steps in and says, essentially, perfect, I've got just the thing. Not a made-up tale, but a true story based on Solon, based on Egyptian records, going back 9,000 years. For some readers, that sounds like a straightforward claim. Plato is saying this really happened. Case closed. But if you listen to how Plato talks elsewhere, it gets murkier. In other dialogues, he uses the word mythos for crafted stories that convey a lesson. The myth of in the Republic, the chariot of the soul in the Phaedrus, the story about humans being split in half in the Symposium. He doesn't present these as eyewitness reports. He presents them as likely stories, teaching tools for things that are hard or impossible to know directly. At the same time, he also uses apparently factual stories as if they were parables, reshaping episodes from Athenian history or from the Persian Wars to make philosophical points. He isn't a modern historian, he's a philosopher who treats narrative as a flexible instrument. So when he calls Atlantis a true story, there are three broad lanes scholars tend to drive in. One lane says it's an allegory. In this view, Atlantis is not even loosely historical. It's a purpose-built fiction. The super island with its perfect rings, its gleaming metals, its sudden moral fall, is an engineered mirror of the Athens that Plato criticizes, wealthy, imperial, tempted by power. True here doesn't mean archaeologically accurate, it means true to the moral structure of the world. The island is a symbol of what happens when a city's soul goes wrong. Another lane sees it as a philosophical myth. That's close to allegory, but with a different emphasis. Instead of being a one-to-one code that you can decode, Atlantis equals empire, Athens equals virtue, it's a kind of narrative thought experiment. Plato is exploring big questions. What would a perfectly mixed constitution look like? What happens when divine and mortal elements in a society drift out of balance? How does a just city react to an unjust aggressor? To stage that, he doesn't just invent anything at random. He borrows shapes and motifs from older traditions, stitches them into something new, and calls it true in the sense of grounded in the way the cosmos works, not necessarily in who fought which naval battle in 9600 BCE. The third lane takes seriously the possibility of embellished tradition. Maybe Plato had dim echoes of real events, memories of big floods, of vanished coastal towns, of powerful sea-going peoples who once raided the eastern Mediterranean and then vanished. Maybe Solon did hear stories in Egypt that went back, not 9,000 years, but a few hundred. Those kernels then passed through generations of retelling, through Plato's imagination, and came out as the polished Atlantis we know. In this view, true story means rooted somewhere in the long, messy compost heap of real human memory, even if the details are blown up beyond recognition. Why isn't this settled? Because the text gives you signals pointing in all three directions. On the one hand, the placement is telling. Timaeus and Critias come right after the Republic, where Plato has Socrates ask for a story that will embody his ideal city. Critias explicitly presents Atlantis as the perfect test case. That's a huge genre clue. The dialogue sets you up to expect a narrative that serves a philosophical function. On the other hand, the level of concrete detail is unusual for a pure allegory. We get exact measurements of the plane, specific numbers of triremes, names of kings, a genealogy going back to Poseidon and a mortal woman, a supposed archival chain, Egyptian priests, Solon drop-hides, Critias' grandfather, Critias us. That's the kind of apparatus you build if you want at least the flavour of history. And then there's Plato's own habit of mixing things. He doesn't announce, "Now I will tell you an allegory." He doesn't label the Atlantis story as a mythos the way he does with some of his more obviously symbolic tales. Instead, he blurs categories the way later writers will blur based on a true story with myth. Ancient audiences were probably comfortable with that blur. A well-educated Athenian listening to Timaeus and Critias wouldn't have heard "true story" and immediately think, "Ah yes, this has been source-checked." They were used to epics like Homer's, where memories of real places and wars are woven into a tapestry filled with gods and monsters. They knew Herodotus, who mixes travel report, gossip and legend in one stream. For them, true and untrue weren't rigid boxes. A story could be true in its moral pattern, or its recognition of how cities rise and fall, even if no one was sure whether the island really lay beyond the Pillars of Heracles. That's what we can responsibly infer from genre and placement. Plato is using the voice of history, but inside a philosophical conversation, at a moment where he needs a big, vivid example. The safest assumption is that the history-sounding wrapper is part of the tool. It doesn't force us to say there is zero memory of real events inside, but it also doesn't license us to treat every number and location as a data point. If you're listening to this in the dark, wondering what to do with Atlantis, story, site, or something in between, it helps to separate 3 layers. First, the message. What is Plato actually using Atlantis to talk about? Things like the danger of unchecked imperial power, the fragility of virtue when wealth swells, the idea that whole societies can drift from a divine measure and be corrected, sometimes brutally. That moral architecture is the most stable part of the tale. Second, the setting. The ringed city, the shining metals, the vast plain, the one day and one night disaster. These are story choices. They borrow bits from real geography and real hazards, but they are arranged for dramatic and philosophical effect. They're not blueprints. Third, the possible sources. Older Greek flood myths, memories of cities drowned by earthquakes or subsidence, Egyptian king lists that stretch time into the thousands, tales of powerful western islands and strange seafaring peoples. These are the raw ingredients that might or might not lie underneath. Here we move from text into archaeology and comparative myth, where the ground becomes speculative, and we need to tread carefully. If you hold those 3 layers apart in your mind, message, setting, sources, it becomes easier to enjoy the story without either flattening it into pure fantasy or forcing it into a modern documentary mould. You can let Plato's Atlantis be what it most clearly is in his own work, a crafted narrative experiment about justice, hubris and catastrophe, told in the costume of deep history. Once you see it that way, another question opens up. If Plato was drawing on real-world echoes to dress his moral drama, what kind of world was he hearing about? What seas, what islands, what disasters might have fed his imagination? To answer that, we have to leave the text for a while and step into the Bronze Age Mediterranean, where palaces rose, ships crisscrossed the Aegean, and at least one real island civilization met a violent end. When we say Bronze Age Aegean, don't picture a single kingdom or a neat empire. Picture an inland sea speckled with islands, each one a stepping stone, each one with its own dialect, its own shrine, its own small harbour. On the coasts of mainland Greece and across the islands, people are building something new, not just villages, but palace centres, administrative hubs, storehouses, ritual complexes. And almost all of them are turned toward the water. By around 1700 BCE, the Aegean has become a seascape of palaces and ships. On Crete in particular, you get a kind of early experiment in what a wealthy maritime civilization can look like. Archaeologists call them Minoans, after the mythic king Minos, but that's a modern label. Whoever they called themselves, they were good at two things: extracting surplus from the land and turning the sea into a highway. Their big centres, Knossos, Phaistos, Malea, Zakros, are not brooding citadels on high, defendable crags. They spread out in terraces and courts, with light wells and staircases, storerooms packed with jars for oil, wine, grain. The architecture feels open, almost theatrical, designed as much for movement and ceremony as for defence. That alone sets them apart from the stereotypical Bronze Age warlord culture. Inside, the walls explode with colour. Frescoes show dancers, processions, elaborate costumes, bulls charging and acrobats somersaulting over their backs. There are scenes of ships, of rocky coastlines, of what might be sacred rituals under blue skies. Everything pulses with a sense of motion and watery light. You get the strong impression of a society that has both the time and the resources to pour talent into art. Their writing, the script we call Linear A, appears on clay tablets and religious objects. We can't read it yet. That's one of the deep frustrations of the Bronze Age Aegean. We can see the ledgers, the ceilings, the little accounting labels, but the language they're written in is still mute. Even so, the pattern is recognisable. Central places are collecting goods from the countryside, tracking them, redistributing them. Palatial administration plugged into a hinterland of farmers, shepherds and craftsmen. And the sea is everywhere in the evidence. Cretan pottery turns up in the Cyclades, on the Greek mainland, in the Levant, in Egypt. Egyptian paintings show foreigners bringing gifts that look suspiciously like Minoan products. Tall, elegant stone vases, distinctive metalwork. Some scholars talk about a Minoan thalassocracy, a sea power, maybe even a loose maritime hegemony. We should be cautious with that. There is no clear Minoan empire carved into stone. But there's no doubt that Cretan ships and Cretan styles are moving widely around the eastern Mediterranean. From the perspective of a later Greek looking backward, this would have seemed like a lost golden age of sea kings, a wealthy island civilization running fleets, covered in art, linked to foreign courts, and then gone. That basic shape, shining island, maritime reach, sudden disappearance, is one reason Minoan Crete has been pulled again and again into the gravitational field of Atlantis. If you sail north from Crete, you run into a harder, more jagged world. On the Greek mainland, especially from about 1600 to 1200 BCE, the centres we call Mycenaean take their turn. Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, Thebes. Here the palaces do crouch on hilltops behind massive stone walls. Their gateways are framed by lions carved in relief. The impression is different, less open courtly theatre, more fortified command post. Their script, Linear B, has been deciphered. It records an early form of Greek. The tablets are, for the most part, administrative. Lists of chariot parts, bronze allocations, rations, offerings to gods. Bureaucracy, not epic. When Homer later sings about kings like Agamemnon and Odysseus, this is the deep background, a world where power runs through palaces that can mobilize labour, count everything, and field warriors when needed. Mycenaean art is still refined, inlaid daggers, carved seal stones, painted stirrup jars, but it wears its militarism on its sleeve. Frescoes show chariots and warriors. Grave goods include swords, boars' tusk helmets, armour. Their fortifications overlook harbours, their graves, especially the elite shaft graves at Mycenae, drip with gold, masks, cups, jewellery. They too are plugged into international trade, importing amber from the north, glass from Egypt, tin from who knows where. So by late Bronze Age, the Aegean looks like this, an interconnected system of palace societies, some more oriented toward open harbours and ceremony, some toward hilltop defence and war, all of them tied by sea routes to Cyprus, Anatolia, the Levant, and Egypt. Goods, artisans, scribes, and probably stories move constantly along those watery paths. When modern readers look at Plato's Atlantis, a rich island power with palaces, canals, fleets, and ambitions that stretch across the sea, it's very hard not to see the Bronze Age Aegean flickering underneath. A realm where wealth flows through centralised storehouses, where administration is a specialised craft, where maritime prowess can make or break a polity, where a city's greatness is measured in both ships and shining luxuries. That's why this era has become such a magnet for Atlantis comparisons. It's the closest thing the Eastern Mediterranean actually had to what Plato describes. Sea-oriented complexes, advanced for their time, tangled in both trade and conflict, and later remembered only in fragments. But we need to keep the lines straight between what we know and what we're guessing. We do have hard evidence for the palaces, the ships, the trade. We have the ruined walls at Knossos and Mycenae, the storerooms, the tablets, the imported jars on foreign shores. We know there were abrupt breaks around 1200 BCE when many palatial centres burned or were abandoned. We can trace the collapse of that interconnected system in the archaeological record. What we don't have is any ancient text that clearly says there was a single great island empire that ruled the seas and then sank. There is no Bronze Age inscription that matches Plato's narrative. The link between Atlantis and the Minoans or the Mycenaeans is an inference, a pattern recognition exercise made by much later minds, ours included. Still, when Plato reaches for a picture of a proud, wealthy sea power that rises, overreaches and falls, it's reasonable to think that somewhere in the dim background lie stories about these Bronze Age worlds. Stories of palaces now in ruins, of old kings whose gear still glitters in the ground, of coastal cities that once launched fleets and then disappeared from the living map. To see how one particular catastrophe from that era may have sharpened those memories, and how a real volcanic island might have fed the imagination of a sinking Atlantis, we have to sail north again to a crescent of rock now called Santorini, and to an explosion that shook the Bronze Age Aegean to its core. When you look at Santorini today, that broken ring of cliffs around a flooded centre, it takes a moment to realise you're staring at the aftermath of one of the largest volcanic explosions in human memory. Back then, in the Bronze Age, it wasn't a ring. It was mostly a single island we now call Thera, with a smoking mountain rising over a busy harbour. People lived on its slopes and in its bays. They farmed the thin soil. They fished. They traded. At some point in the 17th century BCE, that world ended in a sequence of events violent enough to scar not just the geology, but the stories people would tell for centuries. The volcano didn't just pop like a cork, it built up. There were earthquakes. There were probably months, maybe years of ominous signs, tremors, strange animal behaviour, ashfall that dusted fields and rooftops. Then the main event came. Modern volcanology, combined with cores from the seabed and ice from Greenland, suggests a truly colossal eruption. The mountain blew itself apart. Ash was hurled tens of kilometres into the sky. Pumice rained down over the surrounding sea, making it hard to sail or even float a boat. A column of fire, gas, and pulverized rock rose and then collapsed, sending deadly, fast-moving pyroclastic flows racing down into the water. When that much material rushes into the sea, displacement does the rest. Great waves, tsunamis, would have radiated outward, slamming into nearby coasts. Crete lies to the south, directly in the line of fire. Modelling suggests walls of water high enough to rip ships from their moorings, smash harbours, flood low-lying coastal towns. Even without myth, you can imagine what that looked like to anyone watching from the shore. The sea pulling back, the horizon bulging, then a roaring wall of water racing landward. Ashfall and aerosols spread far beyond the Aegean. Some layers show up in Anatolia, in the eastern Mediterranean, and perhaps even in parts of Egypt. For at least a few years, harvests would have been disrupted. Sunlight dimmed, weather patterns shifted. You didn't need to live on Thera itself to feel that something fundamental had gone wrong in the world. On the island, under that ash, something extraordinary was preserved. At a site on the south coast we call Akrotiri, excavations have revealed a town that looks like a paused video of Bronze Age life. Multi-story houses, staircases, drains, storage rooms full of jars, streets you can still walk, in theory, if the archaeologists would let you. The buildings had been plastered and painted with frescoes. Ships, harbours, rocky coastlines, intricate patterns, scenes that echo the art of Crete but with their own local flavour. There are no bodies in Akrotiri's ruins, no tangle of skeletons caught in the moment of surprise. That suggests the inhabitants had warning enough to evacuate before the final destruction. They took their valuables and left. What remained, the furniture outlines in ash, the cooking pots, the closets of jars, is domestic, everyday. It's as close as we get to walking into a Bronze Age Aegean port town, mid-routing, and then seeing the sky fall. If you're thinking, that sounds a bit like Atlantis, you're not the first. A prosperous island community, seafaring, plugged into wider trade, suddenly wiped out by a volcanic catastrophe that involves earthquakes, floods, and the sea behaving in unnatural ways. A circular caldera where an island used to be. It's an easy imaginative leap from that real disaster to a story about a magnificent island power that angered the gods and sank. This is the core of what people mean by the Thera hypothesis for Atlantis, the idea that Plato's tale is, at some deep level, a distorted echo of the Thera eruption and its impacts on places like Crete. The timelines are not a perfect fit, though, and that matters. The eruption of Thera is usually dated somewhere around the 1600s BCE, depending on which line of evidence you favour. The Mycenaean and Minoan palaces continue in some form after that, with major destructions and reorganisations happening later, especially around 1450 BCE on Crete, and then again in the wider collapse around 1200 BCE. Plato, writing in the 4th century BCE, puts Atlantis 9,000 years before Solon. Even if you assume he means years before my time, that pushes the supposed Atlantis event back to around 9,600 BCE, deep into the Stone Age, long before palaces, ships with sails or bronze. Nothing about Thera's date matches that on a strict reading. So, if you want Thera to be Atlantis in a literal way, you have to bend something, the numbers, the story, or both. One way people try to bridge the gap is by suggesting that Egyptian priests, or Solon or Plato himself, confused hundreds with thousands. In some reconstructions, the 9,000 years become 900. Suddenly you're in the right neighbourhood, a great maritime power flourishing roughly a millennium before Plato's own classical Athens, destroyed sometime in the hazy past. That at least gets you into the Bronze Age. Even then, the match is not exact. Thera's eruption is earlier than the final fall of the palaces. Its immediate victims were the island communities and coastal settlements, not a single unified island empire. The destruction was real, but it wasn't a clean one-night apocalypse that erased an entire civilization from the map. It was part of a longer, messier sequence of environmental shocks, political shifts, and eventual collapse. And yet, when stories travel, they are rarely careful with dates. Imagine generations of sailors, merchants, and migrants talking about the time when the sea rose up and smashed the coasts, or the island that blew apart and left a hole full of water. Those stories get told and retold across the Aegean and into the eastern Mediterranean. Egyptian scribes hear fragments. Greek poets weave them into myth. By the time a philosopher in Athens needs a powerful example of hubris and divine retribution, he has a whole toolkit of motifs to draw from. A wealthy island, sea power, luxury, arrogant kings, earthquakes, floods, and a city swallowed by the sea. He doesn't need to remember Thera in a documentary sense. He only needs to live in a culture whose deep memory already includes catastrophes like Thera and collapses like the end of the palaces as background noise. That's why many historians treat the Thera catastrophe as a plausible ingredient in the Atlantis recipe rather than the finished dish. The eruption is a well-documented, genuinely massive event in the right broad region, roughly the right general era, affecting exactly the kind of maritime societies that later Greeks looked back on as a lost age. The physical shape of Santorini's caldera, the frozen moment of Akrotiri, the evidence of widespread disruption, all of it feels uncannily Atlantean. But uncannily is not identical. There is no direct line from a Bronze Age eruption report to Plato's text. No ancient marginal note that says this, by the way, is clearly about Thera. The connection lives in the realm of inference and analogy. So when you hear that Atlantis was Santorini, it's safer to translate that in your mind to something like the Thera eruption and its aftermath probably contributed imagery, memories, and emotional weight to the cultural reservoir from which Plato drew. A real island that blew apart can make a fictional island that sank feel more vivid, more grounded, more frightening. In that sense, Santorini doesn't have to be Atlantis to matter. It only has to be one of the real disasters that taught people in the eastern Mediterranean what it meant for land to crumble, for cities to vanish, and for the sea itself to become an enemy. And those lessons didn't stop at the Aegean. To see how far the shockwaves of collapse and invasion spread, and how Egyptian scribes, sea peoples, and later Greeks might have layered yet another set of memories onto the Atlantis story, we have to shift our gaze south and east to the Nile Delta and the long troubled horizon of the Mediterranean world. By the time Solon, and later Plato, were alive, Egypt loomed in the Greek imagination as something like the hard drive of the ancient world. If you were a Greek thinker in the classical age, and you wanted deep time, really ancient history, you pointed to Egypt. Their temples were older, their monuments were bigger. Their writing, those columns of hieroglyphs cut into stone, looked like permanence itself. Greeks travelled there, listened to priests, came back telling stories about wisdom, older than Homer. But there's a gap between that prestige and actual access. Egyptian temple archives were not public libraries. They were controlled by priestly elites, locked behind rituals, language barriers, and social hierarchies. A foreign visitor might get a tour, a conversation, maybe a curated anecdote or two. He was not going to be handed a stack of royal annals and told, "Go nuts, translate everything." So when Plato has an Egyptian priest in his dialogue say, "We have records in our temples about your ancient city and a war with a great island power," that hits a very specific cultural nerve. It sounds like what many Greeks already believed, that somewhere in those hieroglyph-lined corridors there were written memories of things far older than any Greek poem. And in a limited way, they were right. Egyptian inscriptions do preserve accounts of crises and invasions on a scale that would have impressed any listener. One of the most relevant clusters of records comes from around 1200 BCE, the same broad window as the wider Bronze Age collapse. In that period, Egypt's pharaohs suddenly found themselves facing something they called, in modern translation, the Sea Peoples. We don't know what these peoples called themselves. Sea Peoples is our umbrella term, stitched together from Egyptian texts that list foreign names: Shurden, Shekilesh, Peleset, and others, and from carved scenes of battles on land and sea. What the Egyptians describe is a wave of migrating groups and raiders moving through the eastern Mediterranean, attacking coastal cities, clashing with established powers. The most famous account is on the walls of the mortuary temple of Ramesses III at Medinet Habu. There, in carefully ordered scenes, you see ships with high prow and stern, warriors with different helmets and shields, and Egyptian forces fighting them off. The accompanying text boasts that these invaders made a conspiracy in their islands, that no land was able to stand before them, that cities were laid waste, burned, emptied. Then, in the official version, Egypt stands firm. The pharaoh claims to have defeated them by land and sea, preserving the two lands while others fell. Cross-check that with archaeology, and you see a wider pattern. From the Aegean to the Levant, many coastal sites show destruction layers and abrupt changes around this time. Mycenaean palaces in Greece are burned and abandoned. Hittite power in Anatolia disintegrates. Ugarit on the Syrian coast disappears. Trade networks that had tied the Bronze Age Mediterranean together unravel. The Egyptian texts remember this as a moment when peoples from the sea surged in and the world almost came apart. That's not Atlantis. There's no single island empire, no one night submergence. It's messier, multiple groups, a long crisis, climate stress, famines, migrations, wars. But notice the narrative pattern that emerges when it's told in retrospect. Strangers from across the water, a coalition of faraway lands. Cities burned, coasts ravaged, mighty kingdoms shaken. A heroic defender, in this case the pharaoh, who stands as the last barrier between order and total ruin. That kind of large-scale conflict narrative is portable. It doesn't stay fenced inside one culture. Sailors carry fragments of it. Mercenaries who serve in Egypt and then return to Greek ports carry pieces. Traders, pilgrims, and exiles repeat half-remembered versions. How Egypt once faced an alliance of sea-born peoples, how palaces burned, how only the Nile kingdom survived with its institutions intact. Over generations, details blur, names shift. A loose confederation of raiders becomes, in some tellings, a more unified people of the sea. Multiple islands become an island. A decade of sieges and battles condenses into a dramatic clash between one land power and one great maritime foe. When Plato reaches for an example of an ancient war between Athens and a powerful island nation from beyond the Western Straits, he doesn't need to have an exact logbook of 12th century BCE events. He just needs access to a Mediterranean memory pattern, sea-born powers, coastal destruction, Egyptian resistance, and a sense that once, long ago, the world almost drowned in chaos. The tricky part is sorting what we actually know from what we infer. From inscriptions, we know that Egyptian rulers in the late Bronze Age fought coalitions that included seafaring groups. We know some of their recorded names. We know they presented these conflicts as existential, world-shaking threats. We know other regions really did suffer upheaval at the same time. What we infer is how those stories travelled, how they were told in Greek, how much a visitor like Solon could have heard, and how faithfully any of it would have made it into Plato's crafted dialogue, centuries later. Egypt, told Solon, is compelling because it maps neatly onto Greek expectations. Of course, the oldest, most literate civilization in the neighbourhood has tablets about some forgotten war. Of course, wise priests in white robes gently correct the Greeks about how young their own traditions are. It's a perfect narrative frame for a philosopher who wants to talk about arrogance, decline, and the fragility of cities. But it's very hard to corroborate. We have no Egyptian text that says, a city called Atlantis attacked a place called Athens. We have no independent record of an Athenian expedition in the Deep Bronze Age leading a coalition of Greeks against a Western island empire. What we have is one chain, Plato quoting Critias, quoting Solon, quoting Egyptian priests, allegedly summarizing temple records. Could there have been some Egyptian story about a powerful island or coastal power that fell? Maybe somewhere in the general noise of the Sea Peoples era, which then got reinterpreted through a Greek lens. It's possible it even feels plausible, but it's a hypothesis built on how stories normally behave, not on direct documentary proof. So, when we place Egypt and the Sea Peoples next to Plato's Atlantis, we're looking at parallel shapes rather than overlapping maps. Both involve seas as highways for danger. Both remember times when maritime powers helped pull a world system apart. Both are preserved not as precise chronicles, but as stylized accounts of a crisis that tested the boundary between order and chaos. For someone like Plato, that was exactly the kind of deep time echo you'd want in the background. A sense that before your own city, before even Homer, the Mediterranean had already seen great powers rise, overreach and fall, and that somewhere, in the stone memory of Egypt, there were still faint records of those drowned ages. But if Egypt's role is mostly as a keeper of motifs and authority, not as a clear-cut historical witness to Atlantis, we still have more ingredients to examine. The geography of Plato's tale, the awkward numbers, and the way maps and measures can stretch when a story crosses centuries. When Plato's Egyptian priest tells Solon that Atlantis lay beyond the pillars of Heracles, a Greek listener didn't need a glossary. They knew that phrase. It was already a mental border. The pillars of Heracles is what Greeks normally called the two great promontories that frame the entrance to the Atlantic, the Rock of Gibraltar on the European side, and one of the big headlands on the African coast opposite. Sometimes writers disagree about exactly which rocky peak counts, but the basic idea is stable. You sail west along the Mediterranean, the sea narrows, cliffs rise on both sides, and then the world abruptly opens. That threshold is the pillars, in myth. Heracles sets them up as a kind of thus far and no farther, either by splitting a mountain or by marking the edge of his travels. In practice, for many Greeks, they were the rim of the familiar map. Inside the straits, a world of known coasts, named islands, trading ports, rival cities. Outside, a huge, mostly theoretical water called the ocean. That ocean was not mapped the way we think of maps. For a long time, ocean, in Greek thought, was less a specific body of water and more a conceptual ring surrounding the land. Early poets like Homer treat it as a kind of encircling river at the world's edge. Philosophers begin to refine that, but even by Plato's day, knowledge of what lay far west of the straits was thin, patchy, and full of guesswork. Some sailors had gone out. Phoenician and Carthaginian navigators almost certainly knew the Atlantic coasts of Africa and Europe better than most Greeks did. There are stories of voyages to tin-rich lands in the far north, to strange foggy islands, to places where the tides are wild and the sea behaves differently. But those stories are edged with secrecy and distortion. Carthage, for example, is said to have kept routes and harbours in the Atlantic as guarded commercial secrets. They had no incentive to publish accurate charts to their rivals in Greek. So, when an Athenian intellectual sits down to imagine an island beyond the pillars, he's working with a hazy margin on the map. Not a blank exactly, but a fog of partial reports and mythic associations. That fuzziness is important. Human imagination tends to inflate as it moves away from home. The farther a place is from your daily experience, the easier it is to stretch it, bend it, make room there for wonders. We can watch this happen in many cultures. Medieval European maps label distant zones with "Here be dragons." Chinese geographers set fantastical lands at the fringes beyond the frontier. In each case, the well-mapped core is mundane, the edges are strange. For Plato's audience, the Western Ocean was one of those edges. You get hints of this in other texts. There are legends of islands of the blessed where heroes rest in perfect climates. There are tales of foggy, difficult waters beyond the known coasts. There are rationalizing attempts by philosophers to decide whether the Atlantic is a limitless expanse or a big circular lake with other continents beyond. In that context, saying there was once an island out there is not like saying there's a big island off Sicily. It's dropping a dramatic possibility into a region that, intellectually, was still up for grabs. Then Plato turns up the volume with a single line. Atlantis, we're told, was larger than Libya and Asia together. This is not a GPS coordinate. It's a rhetorical explosion. Libya, in Greek usage, didn't mean just the modern country. It was a loose term for much of North Africa. Asia could mean Asia Minor, or more vaguely, the lands to the east of Greece. Bundle those together and you're gesturing at all the non-Greek land masses a typical Athenian would picture when thinking about the rest of the world. An island bigger than all that is deliberately outrageous. It tells you two things at once. First, this is mythic scale. We're not talking about a nice little archipelago where you can stop for fresh water. We're talking about a landmass big enough to feel like a rival world. Second, it hammers home Atlantis as a foil. If Athens is small but virtuous, then Atlantis is enormous, wealthy and overextended. Making the island bigger than Libya and Asia together is like saying, imagine a supercontinent of hubris parked just outside the civilized sea. For a philosopher staging a moral drama about power and downfall, that's perfect. But as soon as you detach that phrase from its rhetorical environment and read it literally, trouble starts. Later readers, especially once real maps of the Atlantic existed, looked at Plato's description and started to play their own geography games. If there's an island beyond the pillars, and it's huge, and it commands routes to the opposite continent, where could that possibly be? Some said, Spain's Atlantic coast with a bit of generous scaling. Others pointed to the Canary Islands, Madeira, the Azores. Once Europeans crossed the Atlantic, some began to identify Atlantis with the Americas themselves, arguing that Plato had dimly heard of a western continent from Egyptian sources and blown it up into a moral fable. All of these identifications depend on the same thing. The built-in ambiguity of Plato's geography. Beyond the pillars of Heracles locates Atlantis, somewhere in a vast, underspecified zone. Larger than Libya and Asia tells you scale, but in a dramatized, not cartographic way. The surrounding details that it controlled other islands, that it had access to a further opposite continent, can be made to fit almost any large landmass someone wants to promote as the real Atlantis, provided you're willing to squint at distances and reinterpret terms. That plasticity is a feature, not a bug, for the way legends travel. The more precise a story's geography, the easier it is to falsify. If Plato had said, there's a round island 40 miles west of the Rock of Gibraltar with a mountain on the north side, we could sail there, confirm there's nothing like that, and the myth would wither. Instead, he anchors his island just past a culturally meaningful threshold, and then lets the horizon blur. That makes Atlantis portable. It lets Renaissance explorers claim it in the Caribbean, lets modern writers move it from the mid-Atlantic ridge to Antarctica to the Sahara, always arguing that this, finally, is what Plato really meant. Underneath all those later moves, though the original use of geography in the dialogue is simpler. The pillars mark the edge of the Greek world. Beyond them lies the ocean of the unknown, the place where you can credibly set a vanished empire that once threatened everything and then disappeared without leaving ruins. Your listeners have seen. In that sense, the map in Plato's story is less about longitude and more about psychology. It's drawing a line between the ordered basin of the Mediterranean and the dangerous, tempting outer dark. Atlantis lives just past that line, exactly where tales of lost lands tend to gather. And once you put a lost land there, you've opened another question that still bothers readers. If this war happened beyond the pillars, and if it took place thousands of years before any known Greek city, what do we do with Plato's dates and numbers? In Timaeus, the Egyptian priest doesn't just say, long ago. He tells Solon that the great war between primeval Athens and Atlantis happened 9,000 years before Solon's own visit to Egypt. For a Greek listener, that number doesn't just sound old. It detonates the timeline. Classical Greek history, as they understood it, did not stretch remotely that far back. They had legendary anchors, the Trojan War, the age of Heracles, the flood of Deucalion, but even those mythic events were usually placed in later reckonings 1,000 or 1,500 years before their own time. Philosophers speculated about much longer cosmic cycles, but concrete human history, names of kings, lists of victors, sequences of cities, that fit into a window of a few centuries to maybe a millennium or two. 9,000 years pushes you out past every known monument in Greece, past every remembered dynasty, into a kind of prehistory that for them was almost geological. If you plug that into our calendar, Solon is around 600 BCE. Add 9,000 and you're looking at 9,600 BCE, the end of the last ice age, a world of hunter-gatherers and the very earliest experiments with settled life. We have no trace of marble temples in Athens at that date. No monumental stone architecture at all in Greece. No bronze, no writing. If Plato's number is literal, his ancient Athens is older than the pyramids by thousands of years. That's why this single figure has become one of the main pressure points in the whole Atlantis debate. So what do people do with it? One obvious move is mistranslation. Some ancient writers themselves suggest that Egyptian priests used years, where they really meant something else. For example, lunar months. If the original Egyptian story said 9,000 but meant 9,000 months, that's about 750 solar years. Suddenly the war slips back less than a millennium, into a time when early Greek cities and Egyptian monuments do exist. To many historians, that looks much more plausible as a time frame for whatever fragment of real events might lie behind the story. There's also the possibility of different calendrical systems. Egyptian, civil years, lunar years, regnal years tied to the reign of a king. All of these can get scrambled in transmission. A priest might have used a familiar Egyptian reckoning. A Greek listener, unfamiliar with the technicalities, could have silently converted a lot of ceremonial cycles into years in his own mental vocabulary. Then there's symbolic inflation. Numbers in ancient texts often work more like adjectives than like timestamps. 10,000 in Greek can just mean a huge number. 9 and its multiples show up across cultures as figures of completeness or extremity. Saying 9,000 years ago might in practice function like saying in the unimaginably remote past, the way we might say 1,000,000 years ago about something that happened in our childhood. In that reading, the priest's speech is doing two things at once. It's impressing Solon with Egypt's depth of record. Your people are children, we have thousands and thousands of years of archives, and it's pushing the story safely into a zone where no one can check. A past so remote that it's beyond ordinary memory, beyond monuments anyone in the audience has seen. When we bring Egypt into this, we have to separate what we actually know from what we wish we knew. We do know that Egyptians kept king lists and had a strong sense of dynastic time. We know they marked years, at least, from the early dynastic period onward, and that by the New Kingdom they were looking back on their own past with a sense of immense antiquity. We also know they sometimes used large rounded figures in ways that were more rhetorical than precise, especially when describing the ages of gods or the lengths of mythic reigns. What we don't have is an independent Egyptian inscription saying, in year X of King Y, there was a war with an island called Atlantis 9,000 years ago. Plato is our only source for that specific number in that specific context. Any attempt to reconstruct exactly what an Egyptian priest said to Solon, in what language, using which calendrical unit, is an exercise in layered guesswork. Understood that way, 9,000 stops behaving like a GPS tag and starts looking like a depth marker. It tells the listener, do not try to fold this neatly into your family trees and city chronicles. This story lives in the deep time below history, the era of floods and foundations, when gods still walk the stage and human institutions are just beginning. For a philosopher, that's a useful place to set a moral parable. If the rise and fall of Atlantis happens at that depth, it can be archetypal. It can stand in for cycles of hubris and catastrophe that might have played out many times, without having to match exactly one archaeologically verifiable event. So in a history-first narrative, how should we treat that number? Carefully, we shouldn't simply erase it and pretend Plato said a long time ago. The choice of 9,000 is part of the text's meaning. It signals deliberate remoteness, amplifies Egypt's claims to age, and underscores how far back the author wants to push his cautionary tale. At the same time, we shouldn't build whole historical reconstructions on it, as if it were a modern radiocarbon date. When someone starts mapping Plato's 9,000 years directly onto 9,600 BCE, and then goes hunting for a matching cataclysm with ground-penetrating radar, they're treating a philosophic narrative detail as laboratory data. A cautious approach holds both realities at once. The number is there. It matters. It probably isn't a simple literal chronicle entry. Whether it arose from mistranslated units, from Egyptian rhetorical habit, from Plato's own sense of appropriate mythic depth, or from a blend of all three, it belongs to the story's architecture of deep antiquity more than to any fixed calendar. And once you see that, the question shifts. Instead of asking, where exactly was the cataclysm of 9,600 BCE, you can ask, why does Plato need this war to be that old? What work does that distance do inside his philosophy? To answer that, we have to follow the tale forward, out of the library in size, through Solon, through Plato, and into the long afterlife of Atlantis in the ancient world. When Plato first told this story, nobody could go to a shelf, pull down a file labelled Atlantis, and cross-check the details. There was Plato and then there was silence. In the generation after him, you might expect a flurry of responses, counter-arguments, supportive testimonies, geographers weighing in on where exactly this island lay beyond the pillars of Heracles. We don't see that. Most of the big 4th century philosophers either ignore Atlantis altogether, or, if they mention it, treat it as one more mythic example in a larger discussion. Aristotle is sometimes reported in later sources to have said that the man who invented Atlantis also destroyed it. If that remark is genuine, it's a neat skeptical shrug. Plato made it up for his purposes, and that's the end of it. Why so little noise? Part of the answer is genre. Educated Greeks knew what kind of thing a philosophical dialogue was. They didn't open Timaeus and Critias the way we might open a modern history book. They expected a mixture of plausible tradition, creative reconstruction, and outright invention, stitched together to make a moral or cosmological point. Atlantis lived for them in that grey zone between myth and instruction, not in the same category as city archives or temple ledgers. But another part is the way the story actually reached them. Plato never finished Critias. The dialogue breaks off mid-sentence, right when the war between Atlantis and prehistoric Athens is about to move from setup into full narrative. We never get the climactic campaigns. We never get a detailed description of Atlantis sinking. We never get the promised follow-up dialogue Hermocrates at all. That matters. Later readers, ancient and medieval, inherited an Atlantis that is most vivid as a prologue. A sketched island, an outlined constitution, a looming war, a one-day and one-night cataclysm described briefly in Timaeus, and then the curtain falls. With that kind of fragment, it's easier to mine the story for themes than to treat it as a neat, self-contained chronicle. Ancient moralists and allegorists could point to Atlantis as an example of luxury breeding arrogance, empire overreaching itself, divine punishment following human corruption. They didn't have to worry about the missing battle scenes, because the part that interested them was intact: the rise, the pride, and the fall. By the Hellenistic and Roman periods, a few authors do pick up the thread more directly. Some geographers and paradoxographers, writers who collected marvels and curiosities, list Atlantis alongside distant islands and half-remembered travellers' tales. Strabo, in the early Roman Empire, is cautious. He knows Plato's account. He knows that philosophers used myths as vehicles for ideas, and he tends to file Atlantis under probably invented, but expressing something about ideal states and catastrophes. Others lean into allegory. For writers steeped in Stoic or Platonic traditions, Atlantis can stand for the material world. The body, the unstable realm of sense experience, doomed to collapse when it turns away from order and reason. The proud island becomes a picture of the soul that forgets its proper measure. Then there is the compiling impulse. Later, Platonist commentators and doxographers, people whose job was to summarize and explain earlier doctrines, occasionally rehearse the Atlantis story in miniature just to clarify what Plato was up to. They don't add much new data. They tidy, they echo, they fold Atlantis into catalogues of philosophical myths alongside the cave, the myth of or the story of the primordial androgyne in Symposium. It becomes one case study in a broader pattern, stories that use invented or embellished antiquity to talk about ethics and politics. Still, even in this mostly sceptical, allegorical atmosphere, a few voices treat Atlantis with a more literal curiosity. Some late antique authors wonder whether Plato's island might correlate with real Western lands, not because they have independent evidence, but because by their time, Roman voyages along the Atlantic coasts and into the outer ocean had widened the mental map. A large island beyond the pillars felt less impossible than it had in the 5th century BCE. The line between imagination and geography frayed just a little. Then the institutional landscape changes, as the Roman Empire fragments and Latin Christianity becomes the dominant intellectual framework in the West. Access to Greek philosophical texts narrows. Large chunks of Plato are simply not being copied in Latin monasteries. Timaeus survives in translation and commentary. It has cosmology that Christian thinkers find fascinating, even useful. Critias does not become a staple. In many medieval libraries, if Atlantis appears at all, it appears as a brief mention inside someone else's summary of Timaeus. In the Greek-speaking East, the situation is better. Byzantine scholars preserve more of Plato, including Critias, in Greek manuscripts. But their interests tend to run to theology, logic, rhetoric, and classical literature as models of style. Atlantis is there on the shelf, but it is not a central puzzle demanding exegetical attention. It's one more passage in a revered author, so the medieval knowledge channels are lopsided. In Latin Europe, you have the Timaeus tradition, filtered through Christian commentators like Chalcidius and Augustine, where the creation of the world's soul, and the harmony of the cosmos are hot topics. The Atlantean War mentioned only in passing in Timaeus, before being deferred to the now missing bulk of Critias, looks like a side note. Many readers barely register it. In the Greek East you have fuller access but a narrower, more scholastic use. Plato is a quarry for arguments, not a treasure map for sunken islands. And yet the idea of Atlantis never quite disappears. Partly that's because it is attached to a powerful name. Even when people know only that Plato told of a mighty island that sank long ago, the story inherits his prestige. It's not just a sailor's yarn, it's a philosophical myth, vouched for, in some sense, by one of Antiquity's most authoritative voices. Partly it's because the themes are portable. You don't need the full text to understand there was once a rich, arrogant civilization that perished in a flood. That template fits other myths and scriptures: the flood of Noah, the destruction of Sodom, local legends of drowned cities under lakes and seas. Medieval listeners could blend these patterns without ever realizing they were echoing Plato. And partly it's because the story sits at a crossroads where several enduring desires meet. A desire for deep time, a past older than kings and chronicles. A desire for moral structure, the sense that pride really does come before a fall. And a desire for lost wisdom, the hope that somewhere, once, there was a civilization that knew more than we do, whose traces might still be uncovered. Even when Critias is rarely copied, even when only fragments and summaries circulate, those desires keep the conceptual space of a lost advanced land, drowned in antiquity, open. By the end of the Middle Ages, Atlantis is not front-page news. It's a half-remembered rumour in scholarly margins, a name that occasionally surfaces in learned compilations, more as curiosity than as obsession. But it's there, waiting. So when new oceans open to European ships, when Renaissance humanists begin to recover more of Plato's Greek, when the maps of the world suddenly expand, that old half-sleeping story has somewhere to go. When the Renaissance arrives, Europe does something very strange. On the one hand, it digs backward hard. Humanists scour monasteries for old manuscripts, learn Greek, collate variants, argue about the right way to punctuate Plato. On the other hand, it suddenly lurches forward into oceans no ancient geographer had ever seen. Old texts are coming back to life at precisely the moment that new coastlines are being inked onto maps. In that collision between past and present, Atlantis stops being a dusty marginal note and starts to look useful. Renaissance scholars, especially in Italy, are drunk on antiquity. Plato is no longer a name filtered through Latin summaries. He's a voice again, in his own language. Timaeus and Critias circulate more widely. People can finally read the Atlantis story in full, or at least in a more reliable form than the medieval snippets. At the same time, there's a new appetite for lost wisdom, Hermetic texts, supposed Egyptian revelations, prophecies, Kabbalistic systems. All of it is being sifted and ranked, sorted into elaborate timelines of ancient sages. Plato's claim that Egyptian priests preserved tales from 9,000 years before Solon hits exactly the right nerve. It hints at an abyss of time, and at civilizations older than anything in the Bible or in Roman history. So Atlantis, for a growing circle of humanists and amateurs, becomes an emblem of that hunger. A name you can drop when you want to gesture at worlds submerged beneath the thin skin of recorded history. Then the ships start coming back from the west. Columbus, Vespucci, Cabot. They return with stories of huge lands beyond the Atlantic, inhabited, prosperous, full of crops and cities European scholars have never heard of. The neat tripartite world inherited from antiquity, Europe, Asia, Africa, suddenly sprouts a fourth limb. And if there are whole continents the ancients didn't know about, what else might they have guessed at, dimly, and disguised as myth. It doesn't take long before some writers begin to slide Plato's island across the new maps like a counter in a board game. Maybe, they suggest, Atlantis wasn't a moral fable at all. Maybe it was an early garbled report of lands on the far side of the ocean sea. Perhaps the Atlanteans were ancestors of the peoples now being encountered in the Caribbean, in Mexico, in Peru. There isn't hard evidence for this. The timelines don't match cleanly, the details don't line up. But in an age when sailors are stumbling onto entire archipelagos, no classical author ever mentioned the bar for plausibility shifts. If Aristotle could be wrong about there being nothing beyond the pillars, maybe he could be wrong about Atlantis too. Explorers, missionaries, and court cosmographers begin to weave Atlantis into their explanations of the New World. Some take it as a flattering precursor. The ancients had already half seen America in their myths, and modern Europeans are now completing the discovery. Others use it as a way to domesticate shock. The unfamiliar peoples and customs across the Atlantic are folded into a story that in some sense belongs to Europe, because it comes with a Platonic pedigree. The island becomes portable in another way as well. Renaissance and early modern writers are increasingly interested in ideal societies. Thomas More publishes Utopia in 1516, using an imaginary island to critique English politics and church practices. A wave of nowhere lands follows, isolated communities with perfect laws, perfect education, perfect balance between work and leisure. Atlantis slips easily into this company. For some authors, it's a negative utopia, a golden age gone wrong. They cite Plato's description of an initially virtuous orderly island that decays into luxury and hubris as a warning. This is what happens, they say, when princes neglect philosophy, when empire forgets moderation, when wealth outruns virtue. Atlantis becomes shorthand for the fate of any powerful state that loses its moral bearings. For others, the early virtuous Atlantis, before the corruption sets in, looks like a pattern for good government. A carefully planned capital, a system of ranks, a mixture of divine ancestry and rational law. If only, they imply, modern kings would recover the original Atlantean wisdom rather than repeating its downfall. Either way, the name carries rhetorical weight. To call a policy Atlantean is to suggest that it partakes of greatness and danger in equal measure. As printing spreads, the story fragments and multiplies. No longer confined to a few laboriously copied manuscripts, Plato's dialogues are now available in cheap editions, in multiple languages, with extensive marginal notes. Compilers of wonders, encyclopedists, theologians, political theorists, all can skim Atlantis, extract the parts that suit them, and plug them into their own agendas. This is the point where scholarship and speculation begin to braid together. On one page, a careful philologist might debate whether Plato's numerical figures should be read as literal years or as corrupted units. On the next, a mapmaker might confidently label some mid-Atlantic seamounts as the remains of Atlantis, based largely on imagination. Serious attempts are made to correlate the dialogue's geography with real coastlines, currents, and seismic zones. At the same time, pamphlets appear that place Atlantis almost anywhere, in the Azores, in the Caribbean, under the Sahara, along the coasts of northern Europe. The authority of print gives all of these proposals a similar visual weight. They sit side by side in books and atlases, inviting readers to treat them as comparable options in a puzzle that just needs the right clue. By the Enlightenment, a shift is becoming clear. For many philosophers, Plato's story is still first and foremost a myth with a moral, a vehicle for discussing luxury, corruption, and the fragility of states. Thinkers shaped by rationalism and empiricism are wary of taking a single ancient text as geological evidence. But in the broader culture, the balance tilts. Atlantis is increasingly handled as a location problem to be solved. Where exactly did it lie? What modern people descend from its inhabitants? Can we match Plato's one day and one night catastrophe to a specific flood or earthquake in natural history? The old philosophical reading hasn't vanished. It still lives in academic commentaries and in the work of more sceptical writers. Yet beside it, and often louder than it, stands a new enthusiasm: the hunt. An island described in a half-finished dialogue, once treated as a crafted example of political hubris, is now being tracked across globes, probed with early geological theories, and invoked in debates about the origins of civilizations on multiple continents. Atlantis has crossed a threshold. It is no longer only a story about how states rise and fall. It has become a candidate in the emerging science of the Earth, a missing chapter in world history, waiting perhaps to be rediscovered under some future explorer's keel. By the time we reach the 19th and 20th centuries, that hunt for Atlantis has done something else. It has discovered an audience: industrial printing, cheap paperbacks, illustrated magazines, radio, film, television, the internet. Each new medium widens the circle of people who can hear Plato's story. And at every step, Atlantis fits the needs of the moment almost too well. It offers mystery without requiring a particular religion, catastrophe without demanding immediate personal fear. A vanished, advanced civilization that can be anything you want it to be. If you live in an age of steam and steel, Atlantis can be a utopia of lost technology, crystal power, death rays, anti-gravity ships. If you're anxious about war and empire, it can be a parable of hubris punished by nature. If you're dissatisfied with modern life, it can be a spiritual golden age where wise priests governed harmonious cities before everything went wrong. Atlantis is a mirror that shows you your favourite fantasy, drowned just far enough in the past that no one can conclusively prove you wrong. Modern Atlantis theories tend to follow recognisable patterns. They usually begin with a hook, a new satellite image, a strange sonar scan, a curious structure on a seafloor, a controversial translation of an old text, something that looks like a clue. Then comes the alignment phase. A theorist picks a point on the map: the Azores, the Caribbean, the Black Sea, Antarctica, you name it, and begins matching details from Plato to features in that region. If the coastline is roughly circular, it becomes the concentric rings of the capital. If there's a plain, it's the Atlantean plain. If there are mountains, they are the facing the sea mountains Plato mentions. Anything that doesn't fit is explained away as a scribal error, a metaphor, or a later corruption. The elements that do line up are treated as smoking guns. This is what selective evidence looks like. Start with the conclusion, Atlantis was here, and then gather only the bits that support it. The thousands of places that do not fit are ignored. The possibility that some of Plato's details are literary inventions, not data points, is quietly removed from the table. Another common move is anachronism. Modern technology, social structures, or spiritual ideas are projected backwards onto a supposed Atlantean super-civilization. Computer circuits become echoes of Atlantean knowledge. Global trade is said to have begun with Atlantean fleets. Religious concepts that appear in texts from a few thousand years ago are attributed to priests who supposedly lived tens of thousands of years before. The fact that our actual archaeological record shows gradual, regionally varied development is brushed aside in favour of a single central source of everything impressive. Underwater discoveries play a major role in this style of reasoning. Sonar images are noisy and ambiguous. Silt, lava flows, fractured bedrock, coral formations, fishing gear, and shipwreck debris can all produce patterns that, from the right angle, look geometric. Parallel lines, right angles, grid-like textures. Our brains are very good at spotting order, especially when we're told to expect it. A blurry sonar return off the coast of Cuba becomes, in some articles, a drowned city. Unusual rock formations off Bimini become a road. Submerged terraces in the Mediterranean are declared to be Atlantean harbours. Later, when geologists identify them as natural formations or as relatively recent human structures from known cultures, the correction rarely travels as far as the original claim. The exciting story of the find is what sticks. None of this means we should dismiss every underwater anomaly out of hand. The sea has covered real settlements, coasts have shifted, harbours have sunk, entire prehistoric landscapes now lie under shallow shelves. But there's a difference between acknowledging that and leaping to Plato's Atlantis has been found. One way to fall asleep peacefully with Atlantis in your mind is to keep a calm little toolkit for evaluating whatever new headline appears. First, provenance. Where did the claim originate? Is it coming from a peer-reviewed paper, a research institute, a recognized survey project? Or from a self-published book, a sensationalist TV show, or a social media channel with a strong incentive to maximize clicks? Second, context. How does the supposed discovery fit into what we already know about that region's geology and archaeology? Have other researchers working in the same area reported similar things? Or is this an isolated observation, not yet cross-checked by independent teams? Third, dating. Have any materials from the site actually been dated, using methods like radiocarbon, thermoluminescence, or stratigraphic analysis? If so, do those dates come anywhere near Plato's supposed timeline, even if we treat his numbers flexibly? Or are we looking at something from, say, the Roman period, the Middle Ages, or the last glacial maximum? Fourth, peer review and expert reaction. Have specialists in relevant fields, not just ancient mysteries enthusiasts, but geologists, underwater archaeologists, philologists weighed in. Disagreement among experts is normal. Total silence or blanket rejection for clear technical reasons is informative too. If a claim rests entirely on one person's interpretation, resists all attempts at replication, and treats criticism as persecution rather than as part of the process, caution is warranted. Keeping these questions in mind doesn't drain the wonder. It protects it, because the real world of ancient history and prehistory is already astonishing. We have evidence of complex societies rising independently in multiple regions. We have submerged Neolithic villages on European lake shores, drowned forests off British coasts, Paleolithic caves that preserve art from tens of thousands of years ago. We have the explosion of symbolic behaviour after our own species' population bottlenecks. We have real volcanic disasters, real tsunamis, real city-levelling earthquakes. When we insist that only a single, perfect, lost super-civilization can make the past interesting, we flatten all of that richness into a cartoon. A more patient approach lets us keep two things at once. We can acknowledge that Plato's Atlantis is, as far as any solid evidence shows, a crafted story, a philosophical thought experiment stitched together from older myths and scattered memories of catastrophe, and still feel that tingle when someone mentions a new sonar survey or a strange structure on the seafloor. We can enjoy the mystery without letting it dictate our standards. In that quiet space, between curiosity and caution, Atlantis can do what it does best. Not solve history, but invite us to keep asking how stories are made, what traces real disasters leave behind, and why we are so drawn, again and again, to the idea that somewhere, beneath the waves or beneath the sands, there was once a perfect beginning. So if we let go for a moment of the urge to pin Atlantis to a specific dot on a map, what are we actually left with? We're left with a story, a very particular kind of story told at a very particular moment by a very particular thinker. Plato is not a travel writer. He's not a court historian. He's a philosopher who puts arguments into the mouths of characters and lets them wrestle in front of you. The Atlantis tale appears in that setting, not as an appendix, not as a field report, but as bait. It's introduced to get your attention, to offer a grand, vivid stage on which he can act out questions he cares about deeply. What makes a city just? What corrupts power? How should a good society respond to wealth, luxury, and flattery? What happens when a strong state forgets what it's for? From that angle, a lot of the Atlantean details suddenly look less like data points and more like carefully chosen props. The symmetry between Atlantis and Athens is almost too perfect. On one side, an island empire blessed with every natural advantage: rich metals, endless timber, fertile plains, a harbour-filled coastline that practically begs to be a naval superpower. A ruling class descended from gods, living in engineered splendour, surrounded by walls plated in precious metals. On the other, an earlier version of Athens, stripped of its later imperial trappings. No empire, no tribute, just a land of modest farms, courageous citizens, and a political order tuned toward virtue rather than expansion. Both powers grow strong, both face temptation. One chooses discipline and solidarity, the other self-indulgence and conquest. The clash between them is not just a battle, it's a moral experiment. This is narrative architecture, not accident. The scale is exaggerated in the same way. The Atlantean plain is huge, the canals perfectly laid out, the population immense, the navy beyond anything we know from the real Bronze Age. If Plato had meant you to nod along and say, "Ah yes, that island off Crete," he could have chosen more modest numbers. Instead, he keeps everything just on the edge of the unbelievable. That edge is where philosophical allegory likes to live. But if we swing too far in that direction, we risk missing something else. Plato isn't inventing in a vacuum. He's building on a shared Mediterranean imagination that has already been primed by centuries of stories about floods, earthquakes, and swallowed cities. We've seen those templates earlier in Greek myth: the flood of Deucalion, the sinking of Helike, entire peoples wiped out by the anger of the gods. In the Near East, there are older layers still. Mesopotamian flood stories, tales of vanished kings and cities that now lie under the sea. To an ancient audience, the idea that a proud, wealthy people could be destroyed suddenly by the natural world was not science fiction. It was a known pattern. Coastal communities watched the sea rise and fall, felt tremors under their feet, saw temples crack. Sailors told each other about strange ruins on the seabed, about shorelines that looked gnawed and broken. The Bronze Age had ended in fire, famine, and movement of peoples. Egypt, which Plato explicitly mentions as the source of Solon's information, had its own records and temple traditions about chaotic times, when foreign fleets attacked, when the 9 bows threatened the land, when cities in the north were carried off in a single day. By Plato's era, those events were centuries in the past. The details were blurred, chronologies were compressed or stretched. Names changed, but the emotional core remained. Once great powers fell. Once the world almost came apart. That's the layer where real-world echoes can sneak into a crafted tale. When Plato has his Egyptian priest describe a powerful confederation attacking inside the Pillars of Heracles, that doesn't have to be a GPS coordinate. It can be a memory fragment of seaborne coalitions. When he talks about a people punished by earthquakes and floods in a single day and night, that doesn't have to be a lab report. It can be a stylized nod to events where earthquakes trigger tsunamis, where coasts are transformed faster than humans can react. So we end up with a hybrid. Some ingredients are almost certainly intentional design. the moral symmetry between virtuous Athens and decadent Atlantis, the way the tale dramatizes Plato's political priorities, the neat alignment between Atlantean vices and the very excesses he criticizes in his own society. Other ingredients feel borrowed from the shared pool of Mediterranean disaster lore: storms, quakes, deluges, drowned harbours, rumours of sunken ruins. Plato doesn't have to have a specific volcanic island in mind for the Thera eruption to cast a long, smoky shadow over coastal imaginations. Once we see that, the hunt for a single smoking gun location starts to look misplaced. It asks the story to be one thing when it was probably built as many things at once. If Atlantis is primarily a moral parable, there's no reason its geography has to line up cleanly with any one place. If it's stitched from old catastrophe motifs, there's no reason all those motifs have to come from the same disaster. If it uses Egypt as a frame, there's no reason its records have to map to a specific scroll in a specific temple archive. And if parts of it do echo real events, say, a great tsunami here, a collapsed harbour there, a lost town told and retold until it swells into a continent, those echoes are likely to be scattered, layered, and transformed by retelling, not preserved like a modern eyewitness report. In that sense, Atlantis does what powerful stories often do. It stands at the crossroads of memory and invention, using bits of reality to anchor a larger, constructed thought experiment. It offers a warning about arrogance, a meditation on the rise and fall of states, and a fantasy of lost perfection, all wrapped in one tale that can be retold and reinterpreted for millennia. That may be why it endures so stubbornly. Whether or not there was ever a real island that looked a little like Plato's description, the function of Atlantis has never depended on archaeological proof. It has depended on our willingness to see ourselves in it. Every time a culture retells the story, it adjusts the mirror. Sometimes Atlantis is a critique of empire, sometimes a lost technological Eden, sometimes a symbol of environmental collapse. The core remains the same, a civilization gifted with power and beauty, tested by abundance, and finally erased. As you drift towards sleep, you don't have to choose between Atlantis was real and Atlantis was fake. You can hold a quieter conclusion. Atlantis is almost certainly a story, but a story grown from deep roots, older myths of flood and ruin, half-remembered shocks in the Bronze Age world, and one philosopher's precise worries about his own city's future. Not a sunken GPS coordinate, but a layered reflection of how humans remember disaster, imagine virtue, and warn themselves about what happens when they forget what they're for. So where does that leave the legend itself? If we strip away the centuries of add-ons, the psychic readings, the Victorian novels, the glossy documentaries that promise the truth revealed, and walk back along the transmission line as far as we can actually see, we arrive in one place. We arrive in Plato, not in a lost Atlantean manuscript, not in a suppressed Egyptian archive, in two philosophical dialogues written in the 4th century BCE in Athens, by a man we know, whose other works survive, whose interests and habits we can trace. From a historian's point of view, that's the solid ground. The earliest text that clearly talks about Atlantis is Plato's Timaeus and Critias. Everyone else you've heard of who mentions Atlantis is downstream from that. Later Greek writers are responding to Plato. Roman writers are responding to Greek discussions of Plato. Medieval and Renaissance thinkers are responding to all of the above. That's the one point in the whole story where the chain of custody is clear. Now, inside Plato's story, there are earlier layers. He says the information comes from Solon, a respected Athenian lawgiver. Solon, in turn, is said to have heard it in Egypt, from priests with access to ancient records. Those records supposedly preserve the memory of a war 9,000 years before Plato's own time. Here, the ground gets softer. Solon is real. but we have no independent confirmation that he ever collected an Egyptian Atlantis tale. Egyptian temples did keep records, but no known Egyptian text describes a war against a great island empire beyond the Western Sea. The 9,000 years might be a deliberate exaggeration, a mistranslation of hundreds, a symbolic number, or just a storytelling choice. All of those are possibilities. None of them can be nailed down with the level of certainty people often want. When we look beyond the dialogue and ask, what could have inspired this? A few candidates rise above the rest. There's the Minoan civilization on Crete and nearby islands, with its sophisticated palaces, its trade networks, its powerful fleet, and its sudden decline after earthquakes and a volcanic eruption. There's the eruption of Thera on modern Santorini, which could have produced tsunamis, ash clouds, and a sense that the sea and sky themselves had turned hostile. There are the Egyptian memories of northern enemies coming from the sea, and of chaotic times when cities were abandoned and political order almost failed. There are the Greek stories of Helike and other drowned towns, swallowed by the earth and the water in a single frightening night. Each of these lines up with a different part of the Platonic picture. None lines up with all of it. That's the pattern that keeps repeating. We can say, Plato is the origin point of the Atlantis legend as we know it. That claim rests on manuscripts, on quoted passages, on a long traceable history of people reading and arguing about the same two dialogues. We can also say his imagination probably drew on real disasters, real ruins, real tales of vanished coasts and shattered cities. Human cultures don't invent catastrophe from nowhere. But the move from probably to definitely, from this might be an echo to this is the lost city, is where we have to be careful. You can feel that care as a kind of habit. When you hear a new lost history claim, you can ask, what's the earliest source? Can we see the text, or only hear about it from someone else? Are the dates and numbers solid or already uncertain in antiquity? Does the evidence really point to one clear conclusion, or are we choosing the most exciting option from several? You don't have to become cynical or closed off. You just stay aware of the difference between the ground you're standing on and the mist that hangs over it. With Atlantis, the ground is Plato's story and the way it fits into his philosophy and his world. The mist is everything else, the vanished island, the global civilization, the crystal power sources, the perfect match between one archaeological site and every detail in the dialogues. The mist is beautiful. It's part of why people keep circling back to this legend. But it's still mist. If you let yourself enjoy both layers at once, the story actually becomes richer. You can appreciate Atlantis as a crafted thought experiment about justice and hubris. You can let your mind wander over the Aegean, imagining palaces now broken under the sea. You can notice how often we tell ourselves versions of the same warning, that great wealth and power are fragile, that nature can reorder everything overnight, that memory is shorter than we think, and you can accept that there will probably never be a single satisfying case-closed answer. The question, in a way, is the point. As you settle into the quiet at the end of this story, you don't need to decide whether Atlantis was a real island, or a pure invention, or a mosaic of old memories. You can let the legend rest where the evidence leaves it, born in Plato's dialogues, fed by older myths and disasters, reshaped again and again by every age that inherits it. A story about a city that forgot what it was for, retold by a species that is still trying to remember what it is for. If you'd like to keep exploring questions like this, gently at this slower pace, it really does help if you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let the algorithm know you want more. If you feel like sharing, you can also leave a comment, telling us where in the world you're listening from tonight. Then, when you're ready, you can let the voices of philosophers and sailors and storytellers fade, and let the waves of the imaginary Atlantic roll quietly back over the lost island, leaving only the sound of your own breathing and the knowledge that some mysteries are most peaceful when they remain a little unresolved.